Roughly 10 feet above the neck, the sinister edge of a sharpened blade casts a shadow over a head of sable locks. A man is trapped under the guillotine, under the darkest, most fearsome shadow that could ever loom over one's very soul. He stares, bright green eyes empty and hollow when faced by the inevitable might of the shadow that lingers ahead. The green-eyed man cannot help but wonder how things came to this. A watching lady in the crowd asked what their lordship had done to deserve such humiliation, and a man scolded her, saying that she should watch her tongue or she'd be next. She should have seen enough to know what ruthless jerks ruled over them. The only thing that the common people could do in this situation was to keep their mouths shut and to stay out of the way. Now that war was upon them all across the continent, common folk like them had no choice but to stay as quiet as mice. Ravens and crows caught above the guillotine as many gathered to watch the eventual execution. It was a time of war and strife. Once the embers of bloodshed took hold of the entire eastern continent, the deadly conflagration simply refused to subside, leading to the hallowed noble house of Marbas to fall as the latest victim of this hellish conflict. The last heir stood kneeling before the people, trapped in the execution device as he waited for his death to come. So, fate exacts its heavy toll. The strong do as they wish while the weak steal to survive. Unlike the strong, the weak had to risk their lives with each passing day, hoping that they would not end up food for the birds. Unlike the strong, the weak had to dance with death itself in the end, one way or another. The gates of hell were the only place that the weak could await the sweet release of their demise. This was the infernal hellscape to which the continent had been reduced. The Lord of House Sylvester, a rival clan to House Marbas, Count Alan de Sylvester, sat with a cocky, disgusting grin on his face as he regarded his victory. The man called for the show to commence and murmuring rang through the crowd. The executioner, a young man who bore a strange and striking resemblance to the man who was supposed to die, was frozen on the spot, earning the disdain of the Lord of Sylvester. The wicked lord called again for the execution to begin. This time, the look-alike struggled forward, wobbling as he moved, hands tightening on the knife he held. The bound form of his victim was before him, and the man came to a stop beside the rope of the guillotine, hesitation thrumming through him. The Lord of Sylvester could barely hide his joy and asked for the boy to quickly cut the rope. Once again, the executioner trudged forward and loomed over the rope that held another's life. Slowly, the arms of the look-alike went up, the inevitability of the situation weighing heavy on his heart and on the hearts of those who watched. The Lord of Sylvester sat forward in anticipation as the rope was cut in a sharp slice. The dark truth was that the deadly sound of the sharp blade severing a person's neck was no different from the chop of a cleaver upon a butcher's block. The executioner stared in empty-eyed horror as drops of crimson blood found a macabre pale canvas on his face. The blood barely registered, and neither did the tears sliding down his face. All it did was lend the inescapable reality to the grim painting within the stench of iron. In fate's cruel fashion, this was the impossible burden that the young boy was charged to bear. To rid the world of Rune von Marbas. No, to cut all ties between the mortal realm and his own father. The blood pooling on the ground belonged to the one who had once sired him and held him safely in his arms. Indeed, the green boy with the empty eyes looked so much like the one who just died because they were related by blood. The boy was Leon von Marbas, the son of the late Rune von Marbas, and a kinslayer who served as his father's executioner. The patriarch. This was what one often called the Lord of the Noble House. As the term suggests, not only is the patriarch a member of the aristocracy, but he also comprises a core pillar of the nation. However, as a certain playwright once wrote, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. The burden of power must only be granted to those who can bear it. Now, Leon sat at a table among a gathering of nobles. He was now the new Lord of House Marbas, and he watched as the nobles bickered amongst themselves angrily. Some were upset at how quickly House Sylvester was growing each day, and there was no telling when they might invade Marbas territory outright. A member in the seat of government said that it would be important for them to bolster their defenses, and they insisted that their patriarch make up his mind at once. They wanted to hear his sage answer. However, Leon just dismissed them. He told his government to remain patient just a little longer, and he was afraid that he needed more time to ponder. The others were, of course, not pleased to hear this, saying it was an urgent matter. The current situation boded ill for the once great house of Marbas. With the demise of his father, Lord Rune von Marbas, Leon von Marbas had risen to the seat of the patriarch of House Marbas at the tender age of 14. House Marbas was once feared as a powerful clan of necromancers, though that reputation had long since faded into the annals of history. The boy paused before the hanging portraits of his deceased parents. His mother and his father were no longer of this world, and he wondered what they would have him do in their stead. The boy knew that his plea would go unanswered, for the dead tell no tales and his parents could not offer wisdom from the great beyond. Nevertheless, the young heir was in sore need of guidance as to how he might restore glory and prosperity to his house. So, he kept walking till he came to a room with large wooden doors. The boy glanced at the portrait that hung above this one. The portrait of Wellen von Marbas, the founding progenitor of their house, and the sole necromancer of the continent in his time. It is said that their house first rose to prominence as the original Marbas patriarch made his name on the battlefield. However, ever since the heyday of their founding patriarch, their lineage had long since struggled to produce another full-fledged necromancer. This then led their family fortune down a path of decline. The young lad sighed. In the end, he had been made to take his own father's life, and he opened the door to his study, stepping inside. The boy strolled over to the table and dusted a copy of the chronicles of their family lineage. The founding Marbas patriarch, Wellan von Marbas, was a nigh mythical figure. With a wave of his hand, he would sweep away his foes like a lethal tempest, summoning waves of the undead in an unrelenting death march. By the time the eastern regions had been subjugated under his conquest, barely 2 months had passed in total. It was said that Wellan had struck a pact with the devil Marbas and unlocked one of the great mysteries of the continent, namely, the secrets of necromancy, using the dread tome Necronomicon. This then granted their founder the might that was needed to rule as sovereign of the continent. Now, the young leader was looking at the Necronomicon itself, a big black tome with an eye in the center of its cover. It was a priceless heirloom that had been passed down from their progenitor himself, and the very time that led to the rise of House Marbas as the sole family of necromancers on the continent. Of course, all those glory days are gone now. Leon casually flipped through the tome, but froze when a voice called out. The voice asked the young patriarch to listen closely. Leon was stunned and wondered where that voice was coming from. He wondered if a telepathic message had reached the patriarch's office despite the anti-magic field. Deciding to get right to it, the young lad asked who he was speaking to. The voice replied that Leon had no reason to be afraid and that it posed no threat to the lad or to his relatives. The young lord asked why he should trust such a bold statement, and a magic red circle appeared around him, overwhelming him with a bright flash of power. Leon managed to crack open his eyes and looked up in shock and surprise to see a great demonic beast standing before him. Shocked, the young lord asked where he was, and the demon hummed, asking if the family's predecessor had neglected to tell them of his existence. The boy was surprised, asking if the beast knew his father. The beast did indeed know his father, and he knew him by name. The creature sensed that the thread tying them together had been severed, so now he had come to Leon. The beast growled, saying that he had long fretted that Rune's nature was way too kind for the lord of a dark house. He should have known that Rune would meet an untimely demise. At any rate, he was not going to cry over it, and he approached Leon, asking who had dealt his father's dying blow. A very awkward conversation had come up, but the dead-eyed boy simply replied that the one to kill his father had been none other than the one standing before the beast. Leon von Marbas had been the one to take his own father's life. This provoked a roar of rage from the Marbas beast. The creature was surprisingly enraged, and he said that he would ask the boy one more time. With a dangerous snarl and an aura that bubbled with ferocious power, the beast asked if Leon was the one who slew his oath-bound contractor. Once again, the young, empty-eyed child replied that he had been the one to kill his father. The demon's eyes bubbled with red furious rage, and he lunged at the boy with a roar. The boy stared at the incoming beast, only a mild look of surprise on his face as he stared into the jaws of death. He could still recall the blood stains on his hands. It was like the demon was browsing through his memories. Marbas saw the fallen body of his former lord and the dead-eyed tears that the young boy had shed. Seeing the truth, the demon declared that Leon had been robbed of his senses. The hands that cut the rope had been his, but the child had not been the one to truly take his father's life. However, Leon insisted that this analysis was not the truth. The demon looked at the desolate boy, slight amusement on the great lion's face. The boy's despair aside, what truly eluded the demon's understanding was the abyssal aura that he could sense within the child. The all-consuming darkness lurked beneath the surface of the young lord's skin, and the demon could not help but wonder how such a young boy had come to be this depressed. A child should not harbor such a potent reserve of magical force. There was a ripple in the waters as the boy stepped forward, and looking closer, the demon could identify power bubbling underneath the boy's feet, red and malicious, with many bodies writhing within. The demon was shocked and thought that the sight he was currently witnessing was just plain absurd. The boy before him had the potential to perhaps even surpass his ancestor. Marbas cleared his throat for a moment and decided to introduce himself. He was Marbas, one of the 72 demons of hell, who turned his back upon the demonic realm and chose to exist alongside humankind instead. A lifelong friend of Wellan von Marbas and the source of the necromancy that became the unique art of House Marbas. The boy recognized the demon from the tales. When the progenitor founded House Marbas, the demon was the one who taught him the forbidden art of necromancy. Indeed, the great beast was the very same one that the boy mentioned. However, he was now bound to the Necronomicon, as he was a formidable demon once upon a time. Marbas the Black Lion, the founding patriarch, often said that necromancy was in the blood of the members of their noble house. However, Leon could not understand how it came to be that the great lion forsook them in the end. The boy's eyes burned with silent anger, and the demon was confused by his accusation. The lion asked why the boy would harbor such a notion, so Leon explained. Ever since the time of their progenitor, Lord Wellan, House Marbas has not been able to produce a necromancer of his caliber. This was certainly a sign then that the lion of their family had abandoned them. The lion listened to the boy's words, paying rapid attention, and then he decided to make one thing clear. The reason why the noble family had been unable to wield the true might of a necromancer was that they were too weak to offer a fitting vessel. The boy was confused and asked more about this vessel thing. Not a single member of the House of Marbas could hold a candle to the sheer talent that Wellan possessed. This was but an omen of their bloodline's decline. Leon was silent as he considered this answer to his question. Then, he decided to take the lion's word for it, and the demon acknowledged that the boy was quick to accept the truth. Of course, for the weak to suffer defeat in times of war was merely an unchanging law of the universe. The lion wondered aloud if this was how the boy had come to terms with the death of his father. The boy said that it made no difference. In all honesty, there was nothing special about his father's passing, and that said, unless the demon had completely turned his back on their house, the boy had a favor to ask of the Lord Marbas. The great lion was curious about this favor, and he decided that he would do no such thing. A favor was an act of kindness in which one possibly stands to make a loss. The boy would refer to any dealings with a demon as a pact or a deal. So, the young patriarch accepted a pact for the power of necromancy. The two locked eyes and Leon asked if it was within the lion's means to grant that power to him. The great demon scoffed with his head in the air, saying that a mere boy had no business questioning his means. Besides, he wondered what exactly he had seen of the boy to make him bestow him with his power. Did the boy really believe that he had the potential worthy to wield his powerful necromancy? Without missing a beat, the boy said that he did have the potential, and had he been some talentless peon, he would never have been permitted to exchange words with such a lofty demon after all. It was said that ordinary folk needed only to simply converse with a demon before they were robbed of all mana, suffered hallucinations, and ultimately lost their lives once the demon was done with them. Considering that the boy remained standing for now, it could only mean that he was worth at least trying out. He would have some modicum of potential. The beast could not fault the young lad's logic, as he himself could see that the boy had talent and grit. Well, Marbas said that any request of a demon would be a pact, and it was important to remember that. The boy said that it was not foolish to believe that he may have something to offer in return. The demon stared at the boy for a moment before he just burst out into mad laughter. There was no way this child could possibly offer anything of significance to the great beast. However, he was amused by the offer. Intrigued, the lion said that he would make a pact with the young lord of the Necromancer's bloodline. Then, Leon asked what price the demon would demand of him, and the great beast grinned maliciously. With a wicked smile, Marbas made it known that his price would be every facet of Leon's being. The empty-eyed lord stared long and hard at his family heirloom, and smiled just as wickedly as he said that this was a relief to hear, for he would gladly surrender every part of his meager existence. It was a great relief to hear, as Leon would happily surrender every part of this meager existence, and the lion flinched for a moment to see such a wicked smile on such a young lad. Meanwhile, back in the council room, the nobles were gathered and they sat in silence. Finally, the old man spoke up, saying that as most of the gentlemen were aware, their current patriarch, Leon von Marbas, commanded very little authority to make decisions of grave import that affected the entire house. Though dressed well, the old man had clearly brought some gutter behavior in with him through the door, and he asked if the other members of the Marbas council were in agreement. As they didn't protest, he took that as agreement and continued. As such, in the old man's capacity as the uncle and closest kin of the current patriarch, he planned to take charge of all matters concerning their house for the foreseeable future. The boy had stepped out for just a few minutes, and his council was already plotting to backstab him. Now, the uncle said that he would allow the rest of the council to speak their minds regarding his appointment as steward of the house. One of the other nobles said that they would be foolish to disapprove, given that the alternative was a mere pup who had not even come of age to inherit the house, or anything in particular. So, the man with the slicked back hair voted for the uncle to take over, saying that they could not leave these crucial decisions to an unworthy child. He believed there was no better fit to take over the matters of the house than the uncle, Sir Kirchhoff. Be that as it may, the mustached noble opposed the motion. Lord Leon was the only direct lineal descendant of the previous patriarch. There was no precedent in their family history for appointing the next patriarch in violation of direct lineage. However, the other man argued that precedent would not help them if their entire lineage got wiped out. He made a very forceful argument. The armies of those Sylvester brigands were marching against them at that very moment. Slicked hair could not fault Mustache for hesitating and raising concerns regarding proper birthright, and whatnot, but they had to know that voting against the uncle was choosing to perish with the clueless young lordling. Slicked hair, on the other hand, would tend to his own survival first. Mustache slammed his hand on the table, accusing the other noble of speaking out of turn. Every last one of them was granted a place at this table by the grace of the late lord. They owed it to him into this house to fight to the very last, not bicker like a bunch of jackals. Even if the sitting patriarch was yet to gather his own faction, Mustache would not stand by and watch his uncle usurp his rightful place as heir. The uncle was a wicked, domineering presence, almost as leery and as unforgivable as the man who'd killed the late lord, and Mustache hoped for guidance from Rune's spirit. It was very unfortunate that their good lord had left them in the clutches of this shameless vulture. The uncle chuckled, saying that it was a bold yet amusing opinion indeed. Leon von Marbas, their current patriarch, had at least one loyal vassal, it seemed. Mustache asked the uncle to speak plainly, as he had no time for games. As loyal as Mustache may be, he lacked any kind of shrewdness that seemed to be required in politics. The uncle, on the other hand, had way too much shrewdness, and he could see that the matter was already a done deal. No other noble at the table had opposed the situation, and Mustache stood with worry on his face. Pullen, his name was, and he was a dear old fellow, so the uncle told the man to take his sage counsel and to let the matter drop. After all, the uncle had gathered them all today, and it was not because he had any regard for Pullen's opinions whatsoever. The mustache man would not be bullied, and he cursed, realizing that this situation was by the wicked uncle's design. Herschel told the plump man to consider his next words carefully for the sake of his family, if nothing else. The mustache man stiffened as he was reminded that they had all gathered for one purpose alone, to make an unsavory choice that would nonetheless be the least of all evils for the house. The plump had no need to stand in the way of their survival, and all they asked was for him to let their wisdom take its course. The mustache man was beginning to realize that he was merely a pawn in the uncle's game from the very beginning. The man begged the old lord's spirit to forgive and have mercy on a pitiful vassal who failed to protect his legacy. While all this was going on, Leon was busy gaining some fancy new demonic powers. He stood before the great demon Marbas, and the lion hummed, noting that all was well, except for one thing. With the change in the subject of the pact, the true extent of the lion's power had been curtailed. As soft and naive as his father Rune was, as Marba's contractor, the man had possessed a far greater mana reserve than his son had currently. Come to think of it, the boy did seem to recall that any demon who made a pact with a human had to draw magic energy from their contractor to replenish their own reserve. The boy then wanted to know what he had to do in that regard, and he wanted to get the process done sooner rather than later. The great lion mentioned that there was precious little that the boy could do as he was now. However, they ought to be sparring with his mana for now. With a snap of his fingers, the big book opened, and the great lion took on a more manageable form to work with the amount of mana that the boy currently had. He now appeared much like the world's fluffiest black kitten. This form should be less burdensome to maintain. Leon was not discouraged, and he figured that this made sense. The creature was certainly adorable enough to pass as a pet. The boy barely got far with his compliment before Marba's demon shadow burned with his true form, as he threatened the boy to never dare call him adorable again. He might be small now, but he swore to make a maze of bite and claw marks all over his contractor's face. Leon was not very deterred by that threat, but for the sake of getting what he wanted, he went with it. The fluffy kitten huffed, saying that now that they were in accord, it was time for them to depart. The boy was surprised and asked where they would be going. Obviously, the young lord wished to obtain strength that would rival even his progenitor, and he did remember asking for that. If he was to stand any chance of ascending to the same heights that he did, then what better way to follow in his footsteps than to literally retrace his footsteps? It sounded good enough to the young lord, so it was time for them to journey to the hidden shrine of his progenitor. He was completely oblivious to his noble seat getting snatched right from under him. The perils of the journey they were about to take could claim his life, and Marbas asked if Leon still wanted to proceed. Of course he did. The boy couldn't care less about staying alive, and he did not get why his resolve kept getting questioned. The kitten was rather proud of him and began to lead the way, telling the young contractor to keep up if he could. So, the young lad followed, and the two proceeded into the nearby forest. The lad recognized the mistwoods of the house Marbas. The forest could be an inscrutable labyrinth for those who were not of his bloodline. Then the boy recalled that his father had told him that only the rightful patriarch may set foot inside the secret shrine itself. However, the boy did find it odd that the place was supposed to grant his predecessors the power of necromancy, but it had failed to do just that. The kitten explained that none of the predecessors had passed the trial, and they had likely been found lacking when it came to the most fundamental requirement of all. Only those who possessed the purest shade of black, the element of the abyss, could clear a path to the shrine. No one to date had been able to satisfy this first condition to make it through the dense bubbling and magic purple fog. The boy could see that it seemed evident enough. Marbas raised a paw, and the fog cleared to reveal a door. Without further ado, the kitten smiled, eager to begin the first trial. Wind whooshed inside the place, and Leon was granted the permission to enter as a descendant. The boy stepped forward, taking in the bricks covered in moss. The boy was warned, of course, that he would no longer have the demon's aid. The boy accepted this as the kitten had mentioned that it was going to be a test after all. The cat grinned as said that he did have one piece of counsel to offer. The boy was to follow the Necronomican's instructions at all times. It would lead the boy on the path toward his reward, the power of necromancy. It was dark at the bottom of the stairs, but there was sufficient lighting with lamps in the glowing necromancy book. Leon paused when he suddenly heard a screech in the dark, and he turned to look down the dark corridor. One of the lamps lit with a green light, and a bunch of green, bulky and muscular people appeared in the dark. The boy stared down and saw beside him a girl tied up before the creatures that seemed to be goblins. With barely any reaction to the situation around him, the boy grabbed his purple book and opened up a few pages. He found the guide on how to utilize the maximum potential of the divine relic, the Necronomicon. The first secret was reanimating the dead. The boy stared at the book in silence for a moment, and he looked at the empty hallways and the goblins that were now charging at him. There did not seem to be any dead to raise, so the boy looked back at the book that said he had to begin by taking a life. Well, he'd already done that once before, so Leon closed the book and picked up his dagger, his eyes shining with the fiery determination of a killer. He took note of the bound bodacious stranger in ripped clothes. Obviously, goblin entertainment, and the goblins growled to see him ogling their prize. The young patriarch stepped forward, knife in hand, and then there was an explosion as one of the goblins leapt into the air, screaming murder. The boy was unfazed as the goblin approached, dodging the creature's first blow. Then he swung his knife, slicing the charging creature before him. It seems the boy had taken some time after patricide to practice his murder a bit. Blood poured from the fallen goblin, and the boy turned, eyes glowing with death, to see who was next. The gloomy boy once found himself in a cemetery, surrounded by the dark air that often accompanied such a somber environment. Then, his father had told him to listen closely. In the great house of Marbas, he asked the child what entity that they held with the highest regard. The answer was simple, of course. The noble house was the kind that idolized death itself. This was because they were a clan of necromancers, with dominion over the undead. Due to this, the noble family had to revere death itself with the highest of regard. The young boy pondered his father's words and then asked what on earth that meant. How was it possible for them to revere death? He thought that necromancers were the kind to take lives whether they wanted to or not. After all, they had to gain more power as dark mages. The boy's father smiled, his green eyes filled with kindness as he noted that his dear son had been studying their family history. Yes, it was true that they were a family of dark mages that were feared by countless people across the continent. However, that did not mean that they had to become heartless villains themselves. That is why the kind father made his son promise him one thing. No matter who Leon faced in battle one day, as long as he held dominion of life or death over them, then Leon had to swear that he would make their end as peaceful as he could. The boy with the empty eyes regarded his father, and he wondered now if his father would still want him to keep his word for every foe that he faced. Now, the boy faced goblins in a dark underground passageway, their shameless lust apparent in the woman that they held captive. Without hesitation, the young noble had cut down one of their numbers and he stared emptily as he was surrounded by the next challengers. His foes held no mourning for their fallen comrade, wicked grins stretching out on their sick and twisted lips, each sure that they could best the young boy. The fallen goblin bled red at the young lad's feet, and he had to ensure to aim for the cervical vertebra with deadly precision. He would kill them with one strike, keeping the promise that he made to his father. There was no better way to dispatch an enemy with as little pain as possible. The little Marbas watched the young noble, noting that it did not seem as though Leon had had much practice with a sword. Yet, the boy had struck the vertebra with pinpoint accuracy. It was amazing to watch the young lad fight. The lion demon wondered if the first strike had just been a fluke, a stroke of luck, or a possible inborn gift of some sort. Grinning with glee, the demon knew that he would soon find out as many goblins made their way towards his young charge. Leon noted that he had managed to take one of them down, but that was more luck than skill. Goblins were a shrewd species and devious by nature. Their eyes glowed red with the anticipation of cutting him to pieces, and he had to keep his guard up. The boy held tightly to the handle of his weapon, bracing himself for their next attack. The darkness did make it a little difficult to judge the elevation, and not only that, but the young boy's vision could darken with each passing moment as it got later in the night. He recalled that a torch flicked out with the first goblin he slew, so he ought to acclimatize to the dark while he could and defeat a large number of foes. Then, instead of cutting through the enemy, the boy should look to pierce and dislodge as precisely as he could. Moving swiftly, the boy leapt behind yet another foe and charged at them, his eyes promising death as he descended to eradicate his foe. The weapon struck true, and yet another green enemy went down with a tortured scream of pain. Just as Leon had suspected, another torch flickered out as the zombie hit the floor. Another goblin growled with a screech, charging at Leon with surprising speed. However, the Marbas noble was ready for him and he swooshed around just in time, dodging out of the way when the goblin brought its weapon down. Two had come at him from different sides, and they met each other in the middle in vicious combat. Taking advantage of their distraction, Leon dispatched yet another goblin, slicing quickly through its throat, and yet another light went out. The boy's eyes were growing used to the dark, so he should be able to see well enough even if more torches went out. It was quite unfortunate, though, that his dagger was starting to suffer damage from his clashes with the vicious beasts. He could not expect the blade to hold up for long. After all, it was just a ceremonial blade. Suddenly, a shriek pulled the boy out of his musings. Yet another goblin came at him, weapon raised, with murder glinting in its eyes. The boy raised his defense immediately, slashing at the creature in a smooth strike that made contact with the evil creature's face. Unfortunately, the cut he made was much too shallow this time, barely more than a ridiculously small scratch. The lion demon was shocked to see Leon abandon his weapon, and the boy raced ahead as he managed to dodge his enemy's strike. The boy's eyes glinted a calculated green, and Marbas stared, impressed and excited. The young noble lunged, escaping the goblin's hit and grabbing the discarded weapon. Leon grabbed the fallen weapon of one of his opponents and faced the goblin again, this time with more vicious tenacity. The boy stomped and leapt forward, slicing at his enemy again with renewed vigor. This time the boy's slash produced better results, and a waterfall of blood rained down from the goblin's guts. A quick slice left the beast in shambles, and the boy stepped back as yet another goblin dropped to the floor. Without wasting time, Leon spun. The Marbas boy had eliminated all of his enemies, and he stepped forward with pride and confidence, walking slowly towards the bound girl in the dungeons. The young lady was bound with a rope at her mouth, and she mumbled in fear. After all, she had just seen her young hero make very quick work of monsters twice her size. The boy took the rope out of her mouth, and the poor girl cried with grateful tears in her eyes. She thanked him for saving her life, her expression the picture of perfect gratitude. She spoke more on how she owed the boy so much, but the poor girl did not go far in her speech before she was then stabbed. The boy's bloody sword had pierced right through the shocked bodacious maiden. Her own hero had taken her life. The girl was speechless, staring into the empty and dark eyes of her rescuer, and he just pulled the sword out, dispatching her as quickly as he had ended the goblins. Leon stared at the girl, saying that he was reminded of yet another piece of wise counsel from his father. He had been told of monsters with the ability to mimic human beings, which his father had encountered during his travels through the continent. This was why it was so easy for him now to end the lady before him, and she fell with a guttural monstrous cry. The monster now revealed herself, growling with claws drawn as she regarded her enemy. The boy's father had also told him to never forget that those who deceived and exploited the trust of others did not deserve peaceful ends. Those kinds of people had to feel the exact same fear and despair that they pushed their victims through. And to that end, Leon's eyes beamed with dark green unfiltered malice as he thought that the demon girl could do with a little lesson in suffering. He felt she should agree. Her screams echoed through the dungeon as he got busy with her, and finally the last torch went out. There was dancing, ladies in beautiful red dresses, charming the audience with their great moves. The banquet hall was packed with drinks and cups, with Leon's uncle at the center of it all, laughing it up in glee because his evil plans were finally coming into fruition. It would not be long before the accursed house was firmly within his grasp, and he celebrated by having his arm in very suggestive positions around two babes. The babes encouraged drunkenness and partying since they wanted his money anyway. A distinguished gentleman like him had to be the head of the household over a baby-faced boy. That made so much more sense after all. The other lady agreed, saying that Sir Kirchel was nothing short of incredible. She never could have imagined that he would use the Sylvesters to get his way. That evil backstabbing cretin had cut a deal with the enemy house to rise to the top. The girls cooked and fed the man's ego, saying that it took a real man to be a backstabbing jerk. The man laughed, buying the flattery, saying that he had to bow and scrape to the Sylvester scum. However, he never had to worry about that anymore, and he happily gulped down a jug full of wine. Bowing and scraping was by far the lesser of two evils when compared to his nephew, whom he called a wet whelp. The man was sure that his nephew would drag House Marbas down a path to extinction. Indeed, it would be 100 times more preferable if he took power instead. After all, who was there who could deny that the man had played this game flawlessly, and he had won? The wicked creature laughed darkly, and all those around him laughed as well, especially that slick-back moron that agreed with him in the first place. Speaking of Slick Hair, he wanted to know what happened to Leon. The boy had wandered off, and Slick Hair wanted to know the plan for disposing of the young patriarch. The people of the estate were deeply loyal to the boy's father, so it would be a little difficult to get rid of the little brat. However, the uncle was mostly unbothered, and he felt that matters did not need to get complicated at all. Smirking wickedly, the old man revealed his plan, saying that the boy's demise would be justified after the fact. After all, dead men tell no tales, and neither do their sons. Slick Hair thought this was well said, and he supposed that the last time anyone heard from the dead was centuries ago when the founding Marbas patriarch had wielded the power of necromancy. More drink was poured, golden and beautiful as the men continued to laugh and celebrate their wickedness. They made a toast to their next and rightful patriarch of the Marbas house, Sir Kirchel. There was laughter and heavy levels of mad drunkenness. The enjoyment went on with the girls dancing suggestively in the background as the wicked men giggled with their girls by their side. Meanwhile, back in a very important house, the patriarch of House Sylvester wanted to be sure that his plan to subjugate House Marbas was progressing as planned. His associates, of course, gave him the relief that he wanted to hear. The Grey Eminence, Kirchel von Marbas, was essentially nothing more than a pawn in their employ. They only needed to wait for the official approval for all-out warfare from the imperial household. The wicked man smirked, laughing at the incorrigible fools that were playing into his hands. They were rather dim to presume that the Sylvester patriarch would hold off on the second course of war as if it had not been long since the first. It created a rather convenient opening for the wicked blonde man. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the Lord's remarkable strategic foresight. The Lord of Sylvester took note of the files that they had no Kirchel. To think that the centuries-long history of House Marbas would come to an end at the hands of some short-sighted dunce of a traitor. It was truly pitiful. Still, the Sylvester noble smiled as he dreamed of the night of delights. He told his men to hasten their preparation at once. Nothing would get in the way of his perfect victory. First, he killed the father, and now the man eagerly looked forward to delighting in the death of the son. The wicked man could scarcely wait to hear the sweet sound of their cries of peril. Meanwhile, the son in question had just successfully eliminated the last of the monsters that he found within the underground. His blade spilled blood on the floor as he pulled it from the body of his latest victim, and those green eyes adjusted to the pitch darkness that now surrounded him with the torches snuffed out. The girl seemed to be the last of the monsters in there. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light and the entire underground area instantly became illuminated. The boy stared at the fire that now crackled and popped in its stand, and he ran his fingers through his hair in part exhaustion and part awe. Marbas thought that the young lad was incredible. The kitten pounced with joy as he was yet to meet such a deranged contractor in all of his existence. The demon found absolute delight in how insane Leon was turning out to be. The boy was shocked and found himself knocked right into a pool of blood, losing his weapon and everything, as he did not want to hurt Marbas. The happy demon felt like his new charge surely possessed enough grit to survive in a camp full of orcs since he was so good at keeping his wits about him. Tiny paw pads happily kneaded Leon's face, and the boy just stared emptily as usual, probably wishing that he was not sloshing about in blood. Marbas continued to laugh and praise him, somehow figuring out the demon in disguise as a human, and how the boy had not hesitated to run it through with a sword. Leon finally rose, saying that he would prefer to avoid any run-ins with orcs if at all possible. Then he gently set down his new kitten on the floor. The boy knew all about how orcs despised humans above all else as a race. That was no matter to the demon, as he wanted to know why Leon had known to suspect that the girl was in cahoots with the rest. The boy fell silent as he considered the answer to that question. It was actually quite simple for him. When all the other torches had gone out, there was still one that stayed lit, which must mean that another monster remained. Yet the only one left was the girl. The demon was deeply interested in this logic, and Leon explained that when they first set foot in that place, he had realized that the torches in the area burned a different color than what they had seen thus far. The torches burned green to signify the goblins that they had to slay. Green was the shade of the dead, and sure enough, with each monster that he slew, the torches flickered out one by one. However, the boy then noticed that there was one more torch flaring bright in the color of green. So obviously there was one monster left, and the boy could not move on until it was dead, although its death had been a bit more brutal than the others. The kitten stared at the boy who sat in a pool of blood, excited by how frightfully cold-blooded his new charge was. The demon had not expected a mere boy of 14 to surmise so much under such dire circumstances. Now the boy was just looking around, taking in his blood-soaked shirt. When one's life was at stake, it could be difficult enough to read the situation, let alone spring to action without a moment's hesitation. Yet, Leon did exactly that in an instant, dispatching all the enemies by himself in the end. Perhaps there was more to the young charge than just the vast mana reserve that he contained. It could be that the young noble was hiding something truly special as well, something that even the boy did not know existed. This thought truly fascinated Marbas, and the demon smirked with joy. It was rather entertaining. He could not wait to see what the boy showed him next. Then, Marbas lifted the necromancy book. With Welland's first trial behind him, it was time for them to proceed to the next step in learning necromancy. The book's pages flipped open and then stopped on the next lesson. After taking the life of a living being, it was then time to raise the fallen. The boy stared at the book for a moment, and hummed as he understood that he had to raise the undead. There was a nice selection of corpses for him to use, freshly departed, so the boy smiled rather wickedly, eager to begin. It was time for Leon to raise the undead. The instructions were clear and pretty easy to use in theory. He was just to gaze at the goblins that he killed and then to direct his mana to his eyes to maximize his vision. The boy did just that, mana collecting in his dark green eyes as he stared at the corpses that he made. He would see on each body a threat that linked it to some unknown place, possibly the afterlife or something like that. Sure enough, the young noble turned to the corpses and he saw each string linked to them just like Marbas had explained. In the parlance of necromancers, this thread was apparently called a death line. This was the line that crossed the bounds of death and linked each soul with the thread from this world to the next. So it was apparently the thread of reincarnation. The kitten smiled at how fast his disciple was learning, and he plucked at the strings of death with ease. A necromancer separated the lingering souls of the dead from their bodies to revive their spirits, and then breathed new life into the bodies by combining the souls with the necromancer's own mana. The goblins slowly pushed to their feet as Leon commanded their reanimation as the undead. The goblins smirked wickedly as dark crosses etched onto their head. It seemed that they shared their creator's smile. Each evil goblin came alive, now bubbling with a purple aura surrounding them. Marbas then happily demonstrated to his watching disciple. The goblin lunged at Leon, who stood holding the book, and it stretched out its weapon to the boy, but of course, it did not hurt him. This process was referred to as branding. There were, of course, other means of creating undead minions, but the demon said that the sole method that worked on monsters was branding, and he would save the other methods for another time, as they were still covering the basics. The boy noted that and got to his feet. Now, the demon gave his young charge leave to try controlling the dead by himself. However, before doing any of that, Leon had a question to ask. It had been on his mind for a while. Sure enough, Marbas permitted him to proceed with his question. So, the young boy revealed that his predecessor once told him that it was far more complex to turn a human being undead than it was to turn a monster. The boy, who had only just started training, wanted to know if he had reached a level where he could turn a person undead. The beast laughed as his charge had spoken much like one that may have a need for such a feat. The kitten grinned and asked wickedly what wretch the boy wanted so badly to reanimate, and the boy with dark eyes called upon the name of Kirchel von Marbas. The man that the young boy so badly wanted to turn into a corpse was his own uncle. Meanwhile, his uncle was still somehow happily whining and dining. The man had no sense of self-preservation and was truly the kind that only liked to live in the moment. It was rather embarrassing to watch, especially for a man with so many enemies. He sat with his lackeys and wenches, giggling and getting drunk, and the girls in turn squealed and giggled along with the finished man. Kirchel laughed that the late patriarch was a fool, yet his life had been smooth sailing ever since Rune died. This was the life of a man of opportunity, and he laughed as his girls agreed with him. The man was wasted, and his senseless yes-man was all too happy to agree with him. Now all that remained was to take care of the soul heir. Slick-back hair was sure that Sir Kirchel must be feeling the weight lift somewhat from his shoulders, and the man scoffed, saying that murdering the boy hardly presented that much of a problem. Once again, he asked his cronies to raise their glasses and to drink their fill. There were precious few days that were as auspicious as this. Suddenly, they heard a loud noise and paused. The rumbling continued through the building, and a few things snapped as the place began to shake. Karma was coming, and the girl squealed when the chandelier came down. The old man suddenly scowled and became alert, wondering what was happening. This establishment was supposed to be the kind that could be protected by a magical artifact. It should take more than mere wind to shake the whole building. The old man then got even more serious, telling the girl beside him to be quiet. This was no normal quake. The old man yelled into the dark, asking who had come at this time. There was not a soul remaining in the Marbas territory with the gall to make an attempt against his life, and the man was unafraid. Leon could not help but ask exactly what had given his uncle such a notion. The boy appeared now, his eyes as empty as always as lightning flashed behind him. The uncle stared with amusement, foolishly unafraid of his nephew. The young patriarch of a downtrodden house was what he called him as his own men showed behind him, ready to cut Leon into pieces. The boy stared at his uncle, stared at the man who should have been family, who should have been protecting him. Then, Leon said how gracious of Kirchel to recognize his patriarch. His uncle laughed, seeing no reason why the boy would visit unannounced at such a late hour, and he asked the boy what business he had with him. Now that was truly an odd question. The young patriarch, the lord of the estate, did not require a reason to visit a subject, much less a vassal like his uncle. He did not need to announce his intentions ahead of time for his convenience. Kirchel glared, saying that he supposed any other worthy lord should have no need for such courtesies, but he thought of the young boy as far from worthy to lord over even a box of mice. The man laughed, asking if the boy was frightened that his seat as the patriarch might be taken away from him. It was entirely too late, and the boy's hapless father was no longer around to keep him safe. The man jeered and mocked and laughed at Leon, who just stared coldly at the old man. Then, Leon pushed aside the curtains that separated them, stepping into the chamber where his uncle sat. The boy said that he was not afraid now that he had the means to keep himself safe. The uncle jeered, asking the boy what his newfound wisdom told him about coming here alone. It was bold of the boy to seek out his uncle as if he had multiple lives. However, the young patriarch did not believe confronting his uncle required any manner of boldness. It was bold of the old man to assume that the young boy had come alone. The uncle now frowned, wondering what his nephew was babbling about. That is when the building rumbled once more, and the uncle looked around in shock and confusion. This was bizarre, and these shakes could not come about from some common magic. The magic that thrummed along the walls and the floors was that of the abyss, and now the old man realized that he knew this sensation, and he recognized this darkness far deeper than any mortal could know. The old man flinched, hoping that it was not what he suspected, that after years of dormancy, his worst nightmare could not possibly come true. However, that was exactly the case, and goblins stumbled into the room. The undead had come, and Leon confirmed their existence as the undead. The old man stared, pale with fright, asking how such a thing could be possible. Not even his late brother could harness such a might, talkless at a young age. The boy looked bored, saying that it should be obvious. The house Marbas was in is once more a clan of necromancers. The old man gritted his teeth in rage at this explosive level of bad luck. He yelled and pointed, asking his guards to cut down those unsightly abominations at once. The guards rushed forward to attack the undead, and the undead enemy awaited their approach. The armed men flew forward, swarming the undead with mass numbers and deadly skill, all racing to cut down the boy with the empty eyes. However, the undead got there first. The undead goblins fought to defend their master, grinning with wicked delight. The men were shocked to see the undead fighting back as they had underestimated the boy's potential. The undead did indeed fight back, and it sliced right through one of the armed men. The man toppled in a splash of blood and fell to the floor before the uncle and the rest of his guards. The old man stared in horror as he realized that he was now in some very hot soup. The goblins made quick work of the other guards, flying at great speed to dispatch the armed men. One by one, more guards fell, much to the alarm of the other guards watching, and the uncle called the boy a monster. The guards were sliced and cut down, blood splattering the scene as the old man watched and looked on in abject horror. He could not believe the sight before him, and he felt like something was amiss. The groans of death surrounded him, and blood was splashed throughout the room as the man detected that something terrible was amiss and the situation was completely out of the ordinary. Unless the old man's eyes were deceiving him, he could see that his young nephew was actually commanding the art of necromancy. The old man's gloved hand moved quickly, gathering as much dark energy as he could into his hand. However, he could not fathom how such a thing had happened. The magic hardened into a purple ball in his hand, and the old man prepared to fight back. He called the apparitions a mockery of the founding patriarch's power, but his nephew did not care, saying that it was not odd for the patriarch of House Marbas to have the ability to command the undead. The old man roared that the situation was preposterous. Necromancy was a long-lost art, buried in the annals of history. Not even the boy's father could make use of it in life. There was no way that the uncle would accept that a useless brat like him would be any different and actually be able to use necromancy. The old man refused to entertain the boy's nonsense. The young lad was still unbothered, and said that if his uncle really found that so hard to believe, then he had no choice but to prove his abilities. His already dark eyes became even darker and menacing. However, Leon warned his uncle that he would not like the results of that choice at all. The goblins in the area grew even more menacing. Their wicked smiles were wide, and they lumbered forward, advancing towards Kirchel. The goblins then raced ahead, eager to slaughter their prey, and the old man amazingly stood his ground. In an interesting display of courage, the man really thought that he could easily fight the goblin warriors that had appeared before him. The old man screamed for the monsters to go back to the abyss and unleashed purple fire right at them. One of the goblins screeched, and it looked like that attack would be effective after all. The goblin's body turned to ash, and its undead form began to crumble. The old man smirked with joy and triumph, relieved to see that he could beat the monsters after all. But he had only taken down one, and it was much too soon to start rejoicing. The fallen zombie's skin began to peel off, and it slowed with odd cracks and pops. However, although the monster had taken some damage, it suddenly rocketed forward with a screech of rage, harmed but not beaten, as it lunged at the Lord Kirchel. The old man was shocked to see that he had not even successfully taken down one monster, and he called for his guards to help him. To the old man's shock, all the guards were at his feet, long since dead. The old man cursed and gathered even more purple magic, flinging it at the boy before him. The goblins easily dodged the attack, now understanding that it could actually harm them. They approached faster, brandishing their sword at the evil old man. The uncle had to admit that his prowess with magic was only marginally superior to a novice, but he yelled that there would be consequences for the boy's betrayal, as if the old man had not planned to betray him first. The old man was further held back by the effects of liquor that he'd soaked himself in that night. He was currently in danger, though he kept yelling that it was not a matter that he would brush aside lightly. While he was talking cheap threats, a goblin leapt up beside him and stabbed him through the chest. This was a huge shock to Kirchel, who had not seen that coming at all. The old man groaned in pain, blood leaking from his wounds, but he could still summon some magic to defend himself. However, the magic had started to flake out and shatter. The man could barely hold his concentration. After all, he was drunk. So, he settled on cheap morals, calling the boy out for daring to turn against his own flesh and blood. The man muttered that the child would never be forgiven. Leon just said that he recalled that he once read a treatise on the continent's history with his father. There were victors and the vanquished, with the cold gaze of hindsight separating the two as time went on. The uncle growled at getting lectured, but there was a lesson to be learned from Leon's words. As devoid of emotions as the young boy was, he imagined that he had yet to fathom its true meaning. However, there was one thing that the child learnt from the book. He had learnt that forgiveness was the privilege of the victor. Now the young lad had walked all the way to his uncle, so that they were now standing nearly side by side. The boy knew that his uncle had once been a victor, once upon a time. He supposed that was what his uncle was when he stabbed his father in the back and made his bid for survival. However, times have changed now. The uncle went purple, growling and telling the child to shut his mouth. However, Sir Kirchel von Marbas would not bid farewell, and his nephew hoped that he would suffer every step of the way. The boy would always cherish this day as the man's day of defeat. As for the man's punishment, Leon would take from him the ambition of seeing another day. The goblins leapt at the man with mad glee, their weapons raised. In the name of the patriarch of House Marbas, Kirchel von Marbas was cut down, and he screamed in agony. His cries were music to Leon's ears. Eventually, the man's hand flopped in defeat, and he was dead. Encouraged by Leon's ire, the goblins kept energetically stabbing and cutting into Kirchel even long after the man had passed away, and the Marbas kitten huffed in amusement. The boy was truly deranged as he had suspected, and he was sure even the devil would be moved by this display. A novice necromancer could suddenly wield that with such skill despite this being his very first time. One might think that the boy had been commanding the undead for a decade already. The boy stared as he considered that statement, and then suddenly thought of something. His face back to malicious glee. He had just come up with a rather amusing idea. An idea that probably only he found amusing, and the Marbas kitten wondered what this terrifying idea might be. The next day, a board meeting was called and all the nobles were present. Well, almost all of them. They were surprised that another meeting of the council had been called so soon, and they asked if anyone knew why Sir Kirchel had summoned them once again. Most of the gathered nobles were clueless and had simply come because they'd been called. It seemed that his little sidekick on the council was yet to arrive as well, so they decided to be patient a little longer. Still, another noble worried that an urgent meeting of the council was no laughing matter. His hands shook, wondering if there was news that House Sylvester meant to break the peace treaty and strike while they were in disarray. This was worrisome news, but another noble said that they would not encourage paranoia within their ranks. The man hardly thought that they would be so brash as to break an agreement between two great houses. Besides, the resumption of war would require an official approval from His Majesty himself. The man supposed that the other noble was right, and in any case, they had to stay put and wait for the council head to return. All their doubts would be cleared as soon as Sir Kirchel became the head of their household. Suddenly, there was the sound of footsteps and the creak of the door opening. The nobles turned to see their young lord appear before them. The boy walked past the nobles in silence as he made his way to his seat, and they whispered amongst each other, alarmed because they had thought that this meeting was called by Sir Kirchel. They did not know why Leon was there, and if he meant to challenge his uncle since he was the rightful heir. They were even shamelessly whispering as if he could not hear them. But even they knew that the cruel old man had no regard for such formalities. However, the nobles could not figure out why the boy was here. Suddenly, Leon glanced at all the men before him, and he asked if they had expected to see his uncle instead. Unfortunately, his uncle would not be joining them for this meeting. To put it more clearly, his uncle would be permanently unable to attend. This made the other nobles rather nervous, and they asked the young lord to clarify. He happily did so, taking his seat as he informed the other nobles that his uncle was dead. They stared at the young boy, horror in their eyes, and he confirmed his words, adding that he had even been the one to put an end to the wicked old man. Now, if that answered their question, he asked if anyone had something to say. Maybe some of them would be interested in joining his uncle. The nobles all stared at him in shock. These guys were confused and knee-deep in disbelief. They could not believe what that man had just said. For a moment, they were speechless. Then one of them slammed his fist on the table, saying that if this news was true, then their Lord Patriarch had to explain himself with more than just a few words. How on earth had the most senior elder of House Marbas died when they had scarcely even mourned the passing of the boy's predecessor? Leon thought that was a very good question, and he had a very good answer for that one, too. The other nobles joined in on the outrage, yelling that the boy may be the Patriarch. But he owed them at least an explanation on matters such as the sudden death of their evil leader. The boy stared at the nobles coldly and declared to them all that Kirchel von Marbas was a traitor to their name. They all flinched because they already knew this. Not only had the evil old man turned against his father and surrendered vital information to their enemies in House Sylvester, but the man had even sought to usurp Leon's rightful place at the head of their clan. Now, the other nobles that had supported the old man were starting to sweat. What the boy did find the most curious, however, was that despite all valid grounds for a summary execution, all the other nobles seemed to defend that horrible old man with such zeal and loyalty. Now the other nobles were really starting to sweat. The call to assemble for a meeting of the house had come under Kirchel's name, yet they had all appeared like he was the head of the house. The old man being nowhere in sight lends credence to the claim that he had been slain. Another noble thought that it was quite foolish of the old man to be murdered by a fresh-faced boy, and other panicking nobles noted that this was not the time to be fretting on Kirchel's behalf. If the young Leon somehow managed to assassinate his uncle without a single soul to do his bidding, then they were all in serious trouble. One of the nobles suddenly leapt to his feet, saying that he never suspected that the awful old man could be planning such an evil thing. He even dramatically cursed Kirch's name for daring to commit such a grave offense. It could be that the boy had come into the possession of some strong magical power, and the brunette noble did not want to face the consequences for that. The blonde noble gulped as well and stood, declaring his innocence on the matter as well. They said that they could not have possibly known what the old weasel was plotting, especially something that dastardly. However, the young boy just tapped on the desk in front of him, his eyes dark and threatening. He told them all to be silent. Their claims of innocence and ignorance could be true, but that would nonetheless render them all guilty of a grave crime. They had all been rather negligent for failing to uncover the traitor among their household. The nobles cursed internally about getting baited by Leon, and they'd fallen into his trap. Another noble agreed with the young lord, but he did want to know whether Sir Kirchel was a traitor or not. The noble asked if there was proof of the claim. After all, who was to say that their young lord had not slain an innocent man? The young boy heard the noble out, and then he suddenly got to his feet, saying that they all acted precisely as foreseen by one far more discerning than himself. The other nobles wondered who they could be, but they could not see Marbas seated cheekily on the boy's shoulder. So, that was not their business and they would have to stew in their ignorance. Instead, the boy glanced at them, his eyes dark and malicious. If his nobles wanted proof, then he would provide them with proof. The young lad opened the great book of necromancy and said that they should allow him to demonstrate the betrayal of Kirchel von Marbas. A dark aura swept through the council room, taking all the nobles by surprise and fear. Leon was the trueborn son of House Marbas, and he called forth the name of the damned soul that wandered the realm. Sure enough, from the pits of the underworld, his cackling goblin squad rose with their weapons braced on their shoulders. The other goblins fell out, cackling and laughing as they pulled up in their squad. The book poured out the undead under Leon's control like they were water, and the other nobles watched in horror as the boy used the spell to summon the undead. They could not believe a boy this young could do something like that. Then, from the depths of the underworld, Kirchel von Marbas rose. The man's clothes were tattered and torn, and he cracked his way to the surface. Somehow, the boy Leon had discovered the forgotten magic of the Marbas house, and the nobles stared in horror to see the undead body of Kirchel von Marbas. The boy asked his noble uncle to confess his crimes with whatever remained of his mind. The nobles were absolutely shocked to see the old man in the state that he was now in. They could not believe that this was possible, and the young lad sighed that he was starting to tire of hearing that same question over and over again. He did not think it should be so shocking to see a necromancer from House Marbas when the very foundation of their house was built on necromancy. The goblins screeched with glee as they charged forward, and one noble yelled for everyone to flee for their lives. They truly were terrified, and one noble yelled for the other to make haste. However, they had barely started to run before the noble lost his head. The other noble stumbled back, horrified to see his colleague now missing a head. The shaken brunette turned, a nervous sweat gathering on his brow as he saw the blonde noble begging for mercy. His legs had been cut off, and the man groveled in pain. However, his eyes widened in horror as the young Leon stepped in front of him. The boy said that the meeting was not quite done yet, so none of the nobles were allowed to leave. They would do well to heed their patriarch until he had nothing left to say. With that, the undead uncle marched his disgusting way to the other nobles, his body cracking and crunching with each step he took. The old man was clearly not very fit, and his nephew said that he would ask Kirchel von Marbas if there was a single soul among those present who had no knowledge of their vile deeds. The old man looked at the cowering nobles with his dead eyes, and he confessed that all those who served the last patriarch of their house were turned against him, down to the last man. Not a single man present was ignorant of the uncle's evil ways. That was all that the young boy needed to hear. The nobles cried out in fear and anguish, asking for the young lad to forgive them. They all cried, saying that they would confess to their crimes, and they begged for a chance to prove their loyalty. But these were all men who had led to the young boy being forced to execute his own father. The boy had no mercy for them, and one by one, they were all cut down. Leon watched all the nobles fall and then realized something. By the power vested in him, Leon von Marbas, he therefore proclaimed before the council as he raised his book, that the dark art of necromancy had been restored to the House Marbas. The boy stood over the corpses of those who had plotted and seen to the death of his father. Staring at the room with dead and empty eyes, the man wondered where on earth Sir Pullen had gone. A shaky brunette popped up from the back and explained that the noble Sir Pullen had been cast into the dungeons below on the charge of sedition. So, the dark-haired boy asked the servant to lead the way. The shaky man hopped right to fulfilling his lord's wishes without any hesitation as he was in no hurry to join the others on the chopping block. The dark-haired boy halted when he came before the door, recalling something. Then he said that the rest may choose to flee if it pleases them. The other maids and servants cowered on the floor, in shock at the slaughter that they had just beheld. The young Lord of Marbas warned that he could not be held accountable for what would happen next if they chose to stay. For all of their sakes, he would trust that they would make the prudent choice. With that, the boy left the meeting room, leaving the servants and guards in shocked and terrified silence. Meanwhile, a door creaked open as someone appeared before the Lord of Sylvester. The man greeted his Lord Patriarch before announcing that a letter had just arrived for the man. The Sylvester Lord took the letter and checked out its contents. As the man read with dubious curiosity, his face then morphed to a very amused and very wicked smirk. It was excellent news, and it seemed that even the imperial household was ready to turn its back on the House Marbas. It was only a matter of time that such a thing would happen. After all, outside their progenitor, the house never had much to show for their inflated renown. The little that they had in capital and manpower was also rather laughable. The Lord of Sylvester agreed, saying that they possessed even less of the former than the latter. In any case, the man would proceed as planned for now. The House Marbas would be brought to its knees at last with the War of Noble Houses due to take place next month. Their enemy was sure of it. Then, the Lord asked if his man was up to the task, and the dark-haired man replied that he was ready beyond a shadow of a doubt. There was no chance of their defeat, unless a full-fledged necromancer was to somehow happen to grace the House of Marbas after centuries of mediocrity, or their founding patriarch Wellen von Marbas suddenly returned from the grave. With no chance of either of those two happening, the odds of House Sylvester losing were negligible at most. The man with the mustache smiled, and then said that this war was entirely theirs to win. Meanwhile, in the dungeons of the Marbas home, Sir Pullen cried out and bowed deeply to the young lord, thrilled to see him. He asked for the forgiveness of the young boy, saying that he should not have allowed Kirchel's dark ambitions to fester without his notice, to the point that he cast the young boy in mortal danger. The noble groveled, saying that he deserved nothing short of death, and the nervous manservant was scared of getting a round two of the upstairs show. The boy with the empty eyes regarded Sir Pullen. The man was one of the few loyal vassals left in House Marbas, and the only one to openly oppose his uncle. The sobbing man was someone that the boy had to recruit at all costs, so he told the man to rise. There was still much work to be done and the boy needed the man's services. The noble was surprised, asking the young boy what he wanted with a wretch like him, and the man did indeed look wretched in the moment. Even the boy had to stop to consider how messed up the noble looked after a night in the dungeon. So, first things first, the man had to go take a bath and then meet the boy later in the patriarch's office. There, they would discuss the details of a new line of government. The nobleman was thrilled, saying that the young boy had his eternal gratitude. The man pledged to serve the young lad with everlasting fealty. So, the boy departed and now looked out of his grand gigantic windows, because, Lord forbid, a house has normal-sized windows. The kitten demon hopped on the boy's shoulders and licked his paw in satisfaction. He then asked what the boy would do next now that he had achieved a decent amount of vengeance. Even the young Marba's lord had to ponder that for a bit. The choice was Leon's and they took some time to ponder a bit more. After a bath, Sir Pullen pulled up, and the man flinched, saying that he thought it was quite perilous to make contact with the Sylvesters while impersonating Kirchhoff. It would take an extraordinary performance to feign the man's demeanor convincingly, as he was a very nasty man. Leon already had an idea on how to go about that with a swoosh. He summoned a rather odd-looking demon. It was a monster that began to blend its face as it appeared, taking on the body of his uncle, a rather fearfully convincing appearance. The demon uncle loomed over Sir Pullen quite menacingly, and the man could not help but acknowledge that it was a rather convincing and terrifying appearance, an unholy miracle. The mustache man wondered how the Lord Patriarch could be so nonchalant about the entire affair of being able to raise the undead. What was more, the boy had even made an undead minion of his own uncle. The vassal had been as much as the other vassals, but the boy truly was beyond comparison. Sir Pullen cried tears of joy, beaming that the boy had somehow mastered the art of necromancy. He was like a proud father, and the young lad agreed that he had indeed learnt the art of necromancy. In House Marba's heyday, the young Leon could have laid claim to all that he desired as a true necromancer. It was so cruel that their house had been so unfortunate over the years. The mustache vassal cleared his throat, saying that, naturally, commanding Kirchhoff in his undead form might allow the boy to fool House Sylvester for a time, but they would eventually see through the ruse sooner or later. The undead had no way to recreate handwriting, behavior, or even a manner of speech, and this would be difficult when they confronted people who knew Kirchhoff well. The young Leon agreed that such a situation could present such difficulty, except that the apparition that he had manifested was not an undead created from Kirchhoff's cadaver. The creature that stood before them was merely the undead form of a doppelganger that the boy had somehow happened to find, just lying on the ground. That kind of thing. It was a monster capable of replicating a person's appearance, living memory, and even their abilities to an extent. The fake Kirchhoff even manifested the old man's ghost flames just to prove that point, and the mustache man stared in amazement. The young boy was silent for a bit as he recalled killing the doppelganger and watching the last light go out. The boy had panted, leaning down as he took in the corpse of the fallen woman. He had then asked if the monster had a name. Marbas had explained that she was a doppelganger. It had the power to partially copy a victim's appearance, memory, and abilities, a very unique kind of monster. It was a foul creature that liked to mimic a traveler who was lost or lagging behind, and it would ultimately murder the original and even devour the rest of the victim's companions. The boy pondered such a useful beast, and the demon had chuckled in amusement, giggling that the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Well, after all, Leon had indeed made the decision to claim the doppelganger among his ranks, and he yanked her to her feet. Marbas grinned as he watched this, saying that it was rather kind of the progenitor to leave behind his most previous minion for his precious descendant. The doppelganger body rose as Leon commanded, and she stared at him with the empty eyes of the dead, but the brilliant blue eyes of her demonic form. The boy regarded the girl for a moment, and then asked his mentor if he should be pleased so far. Marbas said that the current situation was definitely a win. The doppelganger creature was quite formidable after all, and it could only transform into a target that the Necromancer had already encountered. However, any target with a more potent magic force than the caster cannot be reanimated as a doppelganger by any means. As long as the boy accepted the terms of the contract, then they could proceed. As talented as the young lad may be, he was still a mere fledgling, and even if he did manage to trap his uncle's soul, it would be moot without any way to maintain his hold over it in the long term. Eventually, the man's soul would return to nothingness. So, the demon suggested that the boy depart from House Marbas for a time, if only to find a solution to this predicament. However, that suggestion was completely out of the question. The boy would not turn his back on his bloodline or on the people that needed him the most. It was clear as day what would happen in his absence. The innocent people of the estate would get massacred at worst, or subjugated at best by the invading Sylvesters. Then the demon asked if the boy was really willing to place his life on the line for these people, and the boy confessed that he would gladly even die for them, since he had no regard for his own life anyway. The demon was surprised to hear this, wondering if it had to do with some misguided sense of loyalty to his household. Well, there were more urgent matters at hand, so the kitten could ignore the current problem and help them move on. The doppelganger then switched to its true shadowy form, and it stared out at its master with cold silver eyes. The kitten smirked, telling the boy to go forth and turn the wretched into his undead, and they would find much use for him after all. The young boy asked his mentor if he knew the doppelganger, and the demon said indeed, he did. It was one of the undead minions that Wellen once commanded, and the boy may find the creature rather a handful to deal with in his current state. Leon needed to be rather mindful that his temperament could be somewhat vexing. Well, keeping all this in mind, the boy went ahead to form a demonic contract with the creature, calling upon the soul of the dead to heed the call of the Marbas heir. Leon summoned the creature back from the land of the dead. The monster was quite large, with small silver eyes and a massive aura of dark purple, with huge pecs too. The creature's eyes glinted with dark malice, and its menacing aura was completely ruined by the black kitten suddenly charging it and telling it to rise and shine. It was time for its idle slumber to end. First things first, they had their first contractor in centuries. The doppelganger was a little mystified and fretted for a moment. Marbas did not have the patience for that and scolded the poor confused thing, telling it to at least take up a different form before it spoke or they would not understand a word that it was trying to say. The doppelganger paused for a moment as it had to choose a form. Then, it had a really great idea. Pressing its hands together in a pretty awesome seal form, the doppelganger began to transform and its body began to change, from peeling off as it claimed a whole new identity. When the smoke cleared, the doppelganger had turned into something that looked almost too much like Leon, and it scolded the demon for its pompous words. The demon, of course, hissed in rage, asking if the creature had a death wish. The doppelganger had completely disrespectfully turned into Leon, and he smirked mockingly at the little kitten, pointing out that it was already dead. Then the two boys looked at each other, the dead with eyes of life while the living boy held dead eyes. Now, Sir Pullen sat strategizing with the young Lord Pullen, saying that if there was a way to emulate Kurtzl down to his minute habits based on his memories, then it might just be possible to fool the Sylvesters with his undead form. The vassal could guarantee that the ruse would work. The man, Sir Pullen, should see to it himself, no matter what it took. It was just the answer that the boy had wished to hear. The vassal then asked his lord if he could ask one final question. It was a given that the Sylvesters would indeed secure the approval of the imperial household and strike House Marbas once more. So, the vassal had to ask his young lord why the boy was insistent on staying despite the approaching danger, even though fleeing would surely offer better odds of survival. It was the same question that the demon had. It would be better for Leon to depart from the noble house for a time, if only to find a solution to growing his powers a bit more. However, the boy revealed that it was his duty to protect this household. That was all. That was the reason that he would stay. The vassal was surprised and then said that he would serve his lord's will to the best of his ability. Still, the vassal pried a little further to understand the reason behind the boy's resolve. The boy pondered the situation for a moment. To tell the truth, he had pondered this matter himself for quite some time. The matter of his resolve. However, the boy could not claim to have some high-minded purpose in mind. In truth, he merely wondered how he could become a worthy head of the household. In fact, he even wondered what it meant to be worthy in the first place. The answer remained unclear for now, in all honesty, which was why the boy chose to buy as much time as possible to find the answer for himself. He then smiled a little wickedly, saying that to that end, he meant to swiftly thwart all those who meant to take from them. As long as the boy did not repeat his father's mistake and he safeguarded all that they had again and again, then one day, he might just find the answer to the question of why he fought so hard for this land. That was as much thought as the boy had put into the matter, so he smiled, triumphant at the conclusion that he had reached. Later, the boy was back in his bedroom with his kitten mentor and his look-alike. The doppelganger mumbled that the house really had fallen so shamefully low and the young lord really had his work cut out for him. The kitten hissed, saying that the crow should call their young master as his lord and that it was a taboo to address his contactor so casually. However, the Lord Marbas himself did not seem to care much for formalities. Even so, the demon thought such crass behavior was just plain abominable. Then, the kitten cleared his throat as he noted that their young lord seemed rather insensitive to social cues. The young lord admitted that this was the case. The demon had a hunch that this would be the situation, and he hopped off the bed. In any case, the crow, also known as the doppelganger, was one of Welland's treasured familiars. In other words, the crow was left to Leon as part of his inheritance. The crow was a loyal servant and an assassin in the service of his ancestor. The boy thought about that and he could see how the ability to shapeshift into any target would be rather handy as an assassin. The crow was really good at killing, and that offered a lot of use to a contractor, unlike a mangy cat with ego problems. It seemed these two did not get along much despite having the same master a few centuries ago. The lion hissed in anger, refuting the cat's claims, and he threatened to send the crow back to the abyss for his insolence. Well, in all seriousness, the Lord of Marbas agreed that he did have need for the shapeshifter's abilities. The crow and the cat had started fighting, but Leon ignored them and asked the crow if he could take up the guise of his late uncle Kurtzl. Such a thing was a piece of snake, according to the crow, though the correct term was a piece of cake as Marbas pointed out. The crow thought that information was not important and that no one should waste their time with human confections when delicious snake venom was available. The young Leon decided to each their own, even though the demon did not encourage humoring the doppelganger. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and the young lord asked who it was. It was indeed Sir Pullen, and he brought to the lord a letter from the Sylvesters. He had come in haste to deliver it to the young boy. The boy read through the letter that said that the Marbas household had abandoned their duties for over a century. In reproach of House Marbas, which gleefully feasted upon the blood, sweat and tears of its subjects, House Sylvester, under the rightful leadership of Count Alan de Sylvester, hereby challenged the House Marbas to a war of noble houses. Should House Marbas surrender in due course, there will be no all-out warfare, and its people will be accepted with open arms. However, if these terms were declined, then House Sylvester's arm would march to the Duchy of Marbas in a month's time and lay waste to all that stood in their way. It was indeed an all-out declaration of war. In service of His Majesty the Emperor's sage guidance and will, Count Alan de Sylvester signed his letter and sealed it. Thus, the storm approached, and they had only a month to prepare for war. The demon curiously asked the young lord what step he would take to solve this dilemma, and if his young lord was frightened. They had precious little time, and they could still flee to fight another day. However, the boy was misunderstood. What Leon truly meant was that he was not sure if he had the patience to wait for a whole month before gleefully cursing the enemies that killed his father. The kitten laughed maniacally and said that the boy was, without doubt, one unhinged contractor. The enemy's army would number in hundreds, and it would be an entirely different level of threat compared to fighting his uncle. Still, the boy was ready to stand and face them regardless. He smirked, saying that they would make it through just fine. And this time, he would not need to spare any thought for mercy. Instead, he would happily use the undead to snuff out every life in sight. In the town, the people talked excitedly among each other, asking if everyone had heard of the rumors that everyone was talking about. Apparently, Sir Kirchel had disappeared overnight. Many people had indeed heard the rumors, and they feared that this was a dark omen, especially since it had only been a few days since the previous patriarch had passed away. Most of the people hoped that the young lord was doing well after losing both his father and his uncle. The poor lad, they were sure he was heartbroken after losing his close blood relatives. They worried about whether he had the grit to weather the storm ahead. The people, however, had a lot of faith in Lord Rune's boy, and they were sure that he would do just fine. After all, it was not like the Sylvesters would come storming through the gates again anytime soon. The townspeople sure hoped that their positive vibes would keep them safe. Meanwhile, Sir Pullen cleared his throat behind them. He then reminded the good fellows that loose lips tended to sink ships and that they should be very careful about the things they say. The young lad was right behind the older vassal, and the townspeople bowed immediately, apologizing and saying that they were just swapping small talk in their free time. They, of course, offered their condolences to the young lad for the loss of the uncle, as it was a very unsavory business. Losing an uncle was tough enough at the best of times, and they could not begin to fathom the depth of the young lord's suffering. On the contrary, the young lord said that his uncle was just fine and still alive. The man was merely on his sick from a sudden bout of illness. The boy figured it would be best to have the realm believe that his uncle was still alive if their ruse was going to work anyway. That said, the young noble told his people not to fret with a smile on his face. The trick to deceiving the enemies was to first deceive a person's allies. Sir Pullen would then ensure the silence of the surviving house vassals and any witnesses to the incident for the time being. The vassal would happily do as his lord commanded, telling the boy that he could depend on him. On that note, the vassal then asked if there was a purpose behind the young boy's visit to the town center. The vassal could have easily procured anything that the young boy needed. All he had to do was ask. Leon much appreciated the vassal's efforts, but there was something that he needed to see for himself. The kitten finally identified what they were looking for. The kitten sensed a potent magic force within the building that they approached. It loomed ahead of them rather menacingly, and the boy asked Sir Pullen to wait there for his return. The vassal was worried, of course, about the young boy going ahead by himself. The young lord was insistent on this matter, and he was ordering the vassal to seal the door behind him. There was much that they had to prepare for. Not a single soul was allowed to enter or to leave the place that Leon approached. The vassal stood outside with concern as the door creaked open, letting the young lord in. It was a place of blood and death. The windows were splattered with dirt, and a lot of the furniture was in disarray. Inside were a bunch of seemingly innocent people cleaning up the floors and the discarded furniture. Inside, the boy spotted a person with cat ears. Leon asked if that was the person they were looking for, and the kitten said that it was without a doubt. A person with cat ears and short silver-white hair, who exposed a bandaged neck and ribbed abs with a scar on his chest. The creature radiated power and handsomeness, and he knelt with his claws to the ground, cleaning up his blood-stained floor. It was such a pity to let such immense talent go to waste. The kitten smiled and said that he supposed it could not be helped that the young lord's household lacked any vassal with a discerning eye for the gifted. So, the young lord stopped before the beast man and asked for a moment of his time. The boy immediately bowed with his head to the floor, asking his mother for forgiveness. He was afraid there was an altercation in their establishment last night due to some rowdy guests, and they were just trying to clean up. They would be most grateful if he would return to enjoy their services at another time. The slave was just apologizing when some lousy woman came out of nowhere and kicked the poor guy when he was already down. She called him Balter and yelled that he spoke rudely to their lord. The unfortunately beautiful lady then smiled and apologized to the young lord, saying that it was not their intention to let a lowly beast man welcome him to their tavern. Then she turned around and slapped the poor guy again for good measure, an amazing display of both racism and unnecessary violence. She even growled and asked the man if he had any idea who he was talking to. The woman pointed at the great Lord Marbas, and the poor bruised beast man apologized for daring to speak to their lord. He was new to the area, so he did not know. Still, Leon insisted that he would like a moment of his time, ignoring all of the social cues present in the building. The lady beamed and said that she would be delighted to offer the young lord her time, but he had no interest in her whatsoever. No, our guy Leon had not come for the attention of women. He would like to speak to the big strong man at her back instead. The boy had a war to fight. He had no time for cuddles and kisses. According to the demon Marbas, this beast man held immense potential for growth. The beast would make an essential vassal for their household. The beast man was shocked to say the least, and just in case he had heard wrong, he kept his head down to avoid getting kicked again by his jealous master. The man could not believe that the lord of the place had come for him. Such a young boy was the head of the house Marbas, and he clearly was messing around with some dark scary magic in his hands. That was very ominous. The beast man was not sure how he felt about that, and he could feel the dark aura pressing against his muscles. Yes, the situation was very ominous. Suddenly, the dark magic bathed him with power, and the beast man was shocked to find that his wounds were healed. For the last time, Leon asked again to have a moment of the creature's time. The lady was shocked that the Lord had come to speak with her personal slave of all things, and she would have gotten great benefits from that had she been nice to her slave at all. The beast man had no right to grant the Lord permission to his time. If anything, the Lord should be asking her for such a favor. The young lord took a look at the lady who was the proprietress of the tavern where the boy had happened to take his uncle's life. It was quite fortunate that she had not been present at that time, or she would not have lived to tell the tale. At any rate, she did not know any better as all the witnesses were dead, so the boy instead grinned as he did have a couple of questions. First, he asked when the Duchy of Marbas allowed the ownership of slaves. Second, though it had been quite some time since his predecessor was taken from him, the boy wanted to know why the lady insisted on addressing the young lord of Marbas by his childhood title. The boy then smiled, asking if it was possible that the lady before him, and all the workers around, who had started to tense, did not recognize him as the worthy Lord Patriarch of House Marbas, and his evil powers grinned along with him. The kitten laughed wickedly, thoroughly enjoying what his bold contractor had to say. Though the boy was young, the demon would not tolerate disrespect to the bearer of his pact, and there would be no mercy for her awful behavior. Leon then said that the wolf boy was not the only person that he was concerned with, and he said that he wanted all the slaves owned by the tavern to be freed immediately. The woman was enraged as the boy informed her that she had 10 minutes to carry out his command, for he would not grant another opportunity for his grace. The lady laughed, asking if the young lord was prepared for whatever happened next. She really thought that she still had the influence of his uncle to use against him. She then laughed mockingly as she had used the wrong title, clearly on purpose. The boy ignored her, saying that he had heard worse after all. Then he turned to the wolf boy, who did not know what he had done to earn such kindness from the young lord. He was just a worthless slave. Suddenly, the beautiful lady snapped her fingers, and a barrage of thugs showed up. She declared that the jig was up and that Sir Kirchel would have their back anyway, so they were free to attack and beat up the young boy. Oh, that poor lady had no idea of the line that she had just crossed with that statement. Leon was usually the forgiving type, but these guys attacked with the aim to seriously hurt him. The wolf was nervous, but Leon just stretched out his hand and waved the dark magic around. It splattered to the floor, congregating in a mess that generated the energetic and excited goblin zombies. Those guys were always happy to leap into action, and they made quick work of the man who had come to attack their master. The poor lady had only just realized the huge mistake that she had made, and her eyes widened in horror. The boy then asked the goblin to lend him one of their blades, as his was rather chipped. Leon retrieved the sword that he desired, and then he walked forward, undeterred by the surrounding chaos. Easily, the boy killed and destroyed, slashing those who stood in his way. The owner of the tavern was speechless and horrified. She had heard that the young heir was just a spineless little boy. She had no idea that Lord Rune had raised a perfect psychopath. She had no idea how a boy that she had thought was useless had gained so much power. The wolf boy was also speechless, and Leon responded that the wolf saw himself as a worthless slave. But in truth, the wolf was very essential to his cause. The wolf was flabbergasted with no idea what the head of the house was even saying, and how a noble would have used for a slave. The wolf was just a drifter, shunned across the continent, and he groveled in the mud on many occasions, begging people to stop hurting him. However, people just kept picking on him, adults and kids alike. They beat him and called him a mongrel, blaming him for all sorts of natural disasters. In the boy's childhood, he could not possibly understand why the human children bullied him so much. He had no understanding why they loved to make him suffer. He had been a child, and none of it made any sense. Now, the boy knew better, and his wolf instincts had activated the more the children beat him. Arising with the power of an edgy protagonist, the wolf arose and howled, screaming in rage as power coursed through him. He had yelled, asking why they would not just leave him alone. There was no particular reason why the children made his life hell. They just beat him because he was different. Enraged, the boy had yelled at his abusers. He had become the target of their hatred, just because he was different. One day, the boy had suddenly come to a realization that he had been too naive to understand before, as he stared at the corpses of the children that he had killed. At first, the wolf could not bring himself to accept it. The bodies had not been created by him. He had not murdered these children. He was too afraid to face the truth and he ran away screaming. The wolf could not accept that he was a heartless monster just like the other boys said that he was. Now, he was in a room with yet another heartless monster that had just shamelessly killed the people who had tried to kill him first. Leon handed the weapon back to the goblin and now faced the arrogant lady of the tavern who was still clutching to Sir Kurchel's name with her life. The poor thing really had just his uncle to go on, and she had the gall to still hurl insults at the young lord, saying that there was nothing he could do to stop them. That was all very amusing, and the boy said that the lady was more right than she knew. That being said, he had no intention of remaining a useless little lordling who made no attempt to fight in the face of injustice. Stretching out his hand, Leon declared that he would soon become a patriarch worthy of House Marbas, and the necromancy magic bubbled in his hand as he faced the terrified woman. The madam had no place in his vision for this estate, as she was just as corrupt as his uncle. The woman yelled and still cursed out the young lord. Well, he made quick work of her, and his face sailed back to his emotionless mask. The boy then turned to the slave, who stared at him in shock and awe. The wolf now considered Leon a murderer with blood on his hands, but somehow he felt no fear when facing the young lord. Leon then smiled, asking to confirm if the wolf's name was Walter. The lord of the manor asked for help as he had need of the wolf's services. It was rather bold of him, but the wolf wanted to know one thing before he offered his allegiance. His blue power bubbled around him in ferocious waves, and his eyes shone black. The wolf was a cub of the demon wolf tribe, and his kind was especially reviled even among all the beast folk. The wolf then asked with pain in his eyes if he would be treated with disdain for the rest of his life. He asked how long he would have to live in shame like a feral beast. Leon reassured him that there would be no more of that. The wolf was surprised, eyes widening at these words. The noble admitted that he knew little of the wolf boy's plight nor the intricacies involved. That said, if the wolf's life was weighed down under baseless prejudices, then from this moment on, those prejudices would no longer be tolerated. The wolf would become a trusted vassal of House Marbas, and the former slave looked in awe at his new master as Leon gave his word with the first kind smile he'd offered to anyone. Leon said that it should be known that the wolf would now be a trusted vassal of House Marbas. The boy gave the beastman his word, and the poor wolf cried in relief. Shakily, the wolf took his new master's hand, and the youth smiled, saying that he would take the wolf's silence as an acceptance of this new life. The wolf happily bowed its head, accepting its new fate at its master's side. He would be more than happy to serve him. Meanwhile, in the grand and opulent palace, a king was greeted by someone as he sat on his regal throne. The man with the crown on his head did not look nearly as fancy as his palace. He was Esteban von Archheim, the emperor of the Archheim Empire, and the crown prince, Louis von Archheim, stood by his side. The prince spoke to vassal Eldores, asking why he had requested the royal audience. The vassal explained that a letter had arrived from the house of Count Sylvester, and the prince was quite annoyed that he was being asked to fuss over a mere count when he was to be concerned with the affairs of nations and duchies. The prince said that his father, who looked quite dead despite being alive, would be incensed by the notion of this insulting approach. However, the vassal on his knees proclaimed that he would not dare to insult the prince. The vassal's sole purpose was to rush in there to deliver good tidings. The prince was a little curious about said good tidings. At present, the crown prince was the most powerful man in the entire empire as the king was currently indisposed. The man did not dare to incur the wrath of the prince in the slightest. The crown prince smiled as he considered the news that had been brought. House Marbas had been the object of the crown prince's hatred for years. That was not great news for the crown prince as House Marbas was one of the three houses of the abyss. Now the vassal asked for the prince to take the opportunity to lend a hand of support to House Sylvester so that they could defeat their common foe once and for all. It was indeed an interesting notion, and the prince chuckled at the thought of it. However, they could not forget that House Marbas was gifted with the power of necromancy, and open warfare against them would prove very tricky. The vassal grinned that the crown prince was rather insightful. However, the renowned noble family currently lacked any heir capable of wielding that monstrous power, so it was the perfect time to strike. Meanwhile, the might of House Sylvester had grown to be on par with that of Duke Marbas. The prince was intrigued and decided that would work. The bowing vassal was told that he could then proceed with his little gambit, as this was as good a time as any to rid the empire of those insufferable grave robbers. The vassal bowed, honoring the prince's name and joyfully saying that the mission would definitely be led to success and victory. The man rushed away, and the prince grinned wickedly. Thanks to his father's magnanimous rule, the prince would finally remove the thorn in his side, the remnant of a bygone era. The prince reassured the tortured-looking king that his legacy was in good hands. The king really looked like he was going through a lot. Soon, everything in the kingdom would belong to the crown prince, and he would wield it under his evil dictatorship. Meanwhile, back at House Marbas, Leon was checking out his allies. He now had a doppelganger, an old vassal, and a beastman dressed in more formal attire. The common folk were still a little wary around the wolf boy's type, so for now, they placed an artifact around his neck. The vassal wolf, of course, was held in the highest regard by the short noble and the lord of the manor. However, they could not very well neglect public opinion. So, for now, Walter's ears would be hidden by magic. The wolf boy was amazed, reaching for the top of his head to find his missing ears. For now, it was best that they did not do anything to hinder the young lord's cause, and they had to work together to achieve excellence. The wolf boy understood the situation, and the vassal smiled at how astute the young man was. Now that they were done getting Walter to look a bit more presentable, the young lord himself intended to speak too, especially regarding a few salient issues of sorts. First of all, the young lord insisted that his new team make their oaths of fealty more than just mere words. So, the young Leona asked if his new servants were prepared to devote undying loyalty to him and to him alone. The vassal burst into tears of joy and admiration. Sir Pullen fell to his knees, immediately swearing allegiance and dedicating his very life to the young boy. He would serve the house of Duke Marbas until the end of his days, and he begged the wonderful young man to grant the lousy vassal a chance to fulfill his oath. It was an oath that bordered on worship, and even the boy was rather overwhelmed by their tear-filled allegiance. The doppelganger himself was rather impressed at how easily his young lord had bent the old human to his will. Even the kitten said that domination and subjugation were core tenets of the House Marbas. To be honest, though, it had taken no effort on Leon's part. The wolf then said that he felt the same way, and his hand pressed to his chest. The young lord sighed, saying that the tenets were the making of his two demon companions, and he had very little to do with it. Though Walter did wonder who the young lord was speaking to. At any rate, before they began in earnest, the man proposed that they strike a deal in a pact bound in mana. Any who refused this pact would be taken as an outsider with no intention of joining him. Walter was surprised and a little worried about a pact bound in mana. This sort of mana-bound covenant was about converting each party's magic force into a pattern. It bound and entwined the two into an unbreakable bond, allowing the two to share all manner of secrets that must be kept in the dark. An invisible magical chain that sealed them both together. The young lord rose to his feet before his supporters. As he had heard no objections, it was time for them to begin. The young lord summoned up his purple and bubbly necromancer magic with a wave of his hand, and a scroll opened before all those in the room. The lion Marbas finally reclaimed his place and form, shooting from a kitten to a wild and strong beast so that the pact could be made. As the house deity of the noble house of Marbas, and the demon that had lent its name to their bloodline, he would stand as witness to the mana-bound pact. Now the other two could see the giant intimidating beast as it asked all those who swore fealty to the contractor to be bound in their soul to the dominion of Marbas. That was some deep demonic binding, and the great lion told them to look upon their lord, who stood before them shining like a firework of purple energy. The sovereign of the undead had risen. The great lion of Marbas was gigantic and tall, towering heavily over the two vassals that beheld the great red lion for the first time. It was truly a magnificent beast, and they were both left speechless for a hot minute. The young boy figured that was enough of the theatrics, and he wanted his trusted vassals to be treated with respect. After all, they chose to stand by his side during a time of peril. The lion huffed and figured that he would take it that they all acceded to the pact. Now, they would know that the price they paid for this pact would be their very souls, and no breach of their pact with the undead sovereign would be tolerated. Sir Pullen bowed before them, saying that he would never conceive of such treachery. The vassal was both amazed and intimidated by the appearance of the mighty beast and wondered if this was truly the demon Marbas with whom the first Lord Marbas made a contract. There was no other explanation as to how Lord Leon was able to wield the power of necromancy. The room was now filled with such a crushing density of mana that the wolf began to sweat. His kind was usually finely attuned to mana by nature, however, the amount of mana popping out of Leon now had frozen him in place with ease. The wolf could barely keep himself from trembling in his presence. This then begged the question, what was the true nature of the young Master Leon? As for the ominous black lion that loomed above the young lord, the massive creature suddenly began to shrink, and it sank lower and lower until the fluffy black kitten was once again before them. The wolf was shocked to see the adorable creature, but Pullen immediately slammed a hand over the wolf's mouth before the boy caused any form of permanent damage. The kitten licked his paw, asking the wolf boy what he had dared to say, and the vassal elder just laughed, saying that the young beastman had just been marveling at the demon's immense frame and fearsome presence. Pullen imagined that the young Walter had never seen such an awe-inspiring sight. These words, of course, flooded the little kitten with pride and haughty satisfaction. However, he did warn the two vassals not to divulge his existence to the mortal realm. After all, they were at war, and in war, knowledge could mean life or death. The demon's form was only visible to those whom he had chosen to reveal himself to. For now, that included Sir Pullen and the wolf boy. The way the demon saw it, the so-called nobles of the human realm had little interest in this Uncle Kirchel to begin with. The wolf boy recalled that name as his old master, the horrid lady of the bar, had gotten a letter, saying that it was to be passed to Sir Kirchel. This was great news and would serve as a fine lead in their preparations. The young lord immediately asked where he might find such a letter. The wolf, of course, had no idea. However, the doppelganger crow smirked, saying that he knew where it was. He called them fools as he pulled out a box from thin air, asking how they could dare to leave behind the spoils of war after all of their trouble. It was a treasure box overflowing with jewels and pretty stones. The kitten groaned, realizing that he should have remembered that the crow was such a greedy little minion. Since they had destroyed the entire tavern and had taken care of the proprietress, it seemed that Crow believed everything left there now belonged to the victor. The emo boy accepted this much and tossed open the box so that he could rummage through its contents. Besides the jewels, he finally found the letter that he was looking for inside the chest. They had it, and the boy raised it with as much triumph as his emo self could muster. It seemed that the doppelganger could indeed prove himself rather useful once in an eon, and he even earned a nice compliment from Marbas. At any rate, the young boy was going to read the letter out loud now, so they all had to pay attention. Adversaries of the House of Marbas were to heed the letter. It had come from the so-called Honorable House of Sylvester, and they hereby purported to serve the will of His Majesty the Emperor in declaring a war of noble houses against their duchy. Despite the Marbas' immense force of arms as a ducal house, they had neglected their duty of serving the ruler, Emperor Esteban von Archheim. This declaration of duty was no light crime, and they would hold him to account on behalf of the crown himself. They were then granted a month to raise the white flag and surrender at that time. This declaration of war would then be withdrawn, and the House Marbas would be absorbed into the House Sylvester as the rightful penalty for its crimes. On the other hand, should the Necromancy House choose to resist, then they must prove their innocence upon the battlefield. It was signed by the Lord of House Sylvester, Count Alan de Sylvester. The others were in shocked silence at this news and what it spelt for their future. They had a month to prepare, and the kitten asked if this time would suffice. The boy saw no issue with the time, but he did, however, have a very amusing idea. Now that the young lad had the ability to control the undead with his mind, it occurred to him that there might be some fun to be had after all. The boy glanced at the doppelganger who watched them curiously. There was a mission for Sir Crow to take on after all, and both the young lord and the kitten smirked wickedly. The declaration of war had been issued to the House Marbas, and the soldiers smirked, saying that the lord should have seen the look on that weasel Kirchel's face. The old man had clung to the soldier's breeches in such a pitiful sight that the man had almost put the backstabbing noble out of his misery there and then. The Lord of Sylvester laughed in mockery, saying he was sure that the backstabbing lord would rue the sting in his back by now. That said, they had to keep the old noble alive for now. For all intents and purposes, Lord Kirchel was a rather useful idiot, and the power of House Marbas was better off in his bumbling hands. Speaking of which, the Lord of Sylvester wanted to know what happened to the young Marbas boy, the so-called rightful heir to the house. Surely, Kirchel would have disposed of the boy by then. Leon von Marbas, the guard, reported that there had been no particular news of him, and he imagined that Kirchel had the boy killed. The Sylvester head smiled in great satisfaction. Then, the guard could not help but ask why their good lord would be concerned about a mere boy of 14. After all, the young Marbas was nothing but a little brat. However, Sylvester had asked his own question. He asked what the guard thought was the greatest injustice a human being could experience. The guard was shocked by such a deep question, as he was no learned scholar, so he could not say. The lord fell silent, and then he said the greatest injustice would be to be faced with an overwhelming foe against which there is no hope, no means of resistance, only watching helplessly as one's entire world comes crashing down. There was no greater suffering than that. Then, the lord asked the guard what he imagined to be the cause of this kind of injustice. The guard was silent for a bit, so the lord replied that it was an inborn talent. That was it, talent of such immense depth that one could not even stand to gaze in awe. The guard was curious at this odd turn in conversation, asking what talent that brat could possibly have. The lord dismissed the man, telling him not to be a fool, while in von Marbas' bloodline was not to be underrated. Nothing could be surprising from that accursed lineage, which was exactly why they must be ready for all possibilities. Meanwhile, back at the Marbas house, Leon was admiring the doppelganger's new face. It was indeed impressive as Crow was once again wearing his face. Human speech seemed so alien to the Crow in his original form, yet he could take the young lord's memories as his own and even mimic the boy's speech with utter precision. The Crow smirked and postured grandly before his master, declaring himself more useful than mere magic force, unlike a certain kitten that shared the house with them. Naturally, Marbas did not care for such an insult and hissed. The kitten attacked the shocked Crow, but just as easily as his face fell apart, it twisted and swished right back into place as the boy smiled in amusement. The kitten hissed at the doppelganger in anger, calling him a worm. Valtas watched the exchange with wonder, asking Sir Pullen if things were always this dramatic, and the vassal just told the young Valter to be quiet more often as he would live longer that way. More importantly, they should begin as they had only a month remaining to prepare for the incoming attack. Leon fished down a sword from the wall and handed it to Valter, asking the beast boy to demonstrate his talents within that time. In other words, if the boy was to fail, then his talents were not worthy, then he would not be a part of Leon's cause going forward. Well, the young boy had no interest in the service of a vassal who was sure to perish, and the choice was his. The wolf boy held tightly to the sword that he held, and he pledged to overcome whatever obstacle stood in his way, and he would earn a place by his master's side no matter what. Once the wolf's place was secure as the lord's most trusted swordsman, he asked if the young lord would grant him one wish. The dark-haired lord nodded and said that he gave the wolf boy his word on that matter. Then, Sir Pullen cleared his throat. In that case, the man would oversee young Valter's martial training. The extent of the aptitude should be made clear by training alongside the knights of House Marbas. So, Sir Pullen was given permission to go ahead. The kitten smiled, and it was time for them to be on their way. The wolfman was not the only one in need of training, and the young lord himself was far away from reaching his true potential as he was. The young boy admitted that he would take his word for it. Onward then. Meanwhile, two swords clashed as the training began. The wolf boy was now in training as he fought against a fighter training him in the way of the sword. Muscles bulged as their swords clashed, steel sliding against steel. Meanwhile, the young necromancer maintained his training and harnessed his talent. The young Leon worked on summoning the undead, and the young Volter worked on fighting the undead. This was a matter of life or death, so neither youth could be sloppy in the matter of harnessing their skills for the greater good. Blue fire burned as the young wolf slashed at the corpses of the undead, his wolf flame burning bright in his veins. No more would Volter be shunned for being different, and he took a moment to catch his breath. Then, the boy crouched for a moment and bowed before the Lord of Marbas. In the short time that they had, the wolf's skills had increased and improved considerably. The young lord welcomed him to house Marbas, and the wolf would now arise as his very first knight. The wolf smiled. His face lit up in joy and relief that he was now accepted as a true member by his young lord. A month later, the day of the War of the Noble Houses came, and the three who headed the house of Marbas stared out at the army before them. The messenger called out, saying that he bore a message from the patriarch of House Marbas. It was Lord Sylvester, and he yelled that despite his gracious final offer to accept their peaceful surrender, the noble house had stubbornly refused to see sense and lay down in his arms. Now that the fools had chosen to fight, their choice would surely result in the death of their innocent subjects as well. Thus it began. Those nattering jackals had shown up at their gates with no concept of honor. The kind Sir Pullen cursed at them, but their demon mascot warned them not to be baited. As he saw it, there was naught but fear in their hearts. Their roars were simply whimpers that echoed their unease. Sir Pullen wondered if the enemy truly was afraid, despite the very difficult situation that they were now in. Host Sylvester had the House of Marbas at a great disadvantage in every conceivable way. There was yet an opening. After all, the man had not forgotten their little scheme had been foiled. The house had planned to use the late Sir Kirchel against them after all. Had the old man been alive for this moment, House Marbas would have no doubt flown the white flag at the first opportunity. That said, they really wondered if his death alone would suffice to shake their composure. However, the kitten snickered that mortals were indeed fragile beings. The slightest shift in fortune often caused endless turmoil within, and they would lament, wondering why their enemies had not surrendered and what gambit had bolstered their morale. Likely, the Lord Sylvester was hesitant, and the moment those fleeting doubts started to take hold, their might of arms may as well have been halved by that point. Sir Pullen admitted that logic made sense, but even at half strength, the man was afraid that their forces still greatly outnumbered theirs. The kitten smirked, saying that a worthy contractor of his would prevail against their full strength, let alone half. The vassals had no reason to be afraid, because Lord Leon was much stronger than what they thought. The young lord did smile, and the older vassal was amazed at the young boy's composure in a time of strife and peril. Immediately, Pullen put his trust in his lord. Indeed, even the demon was rather shocked by his young lord's sheer talent. During the time of training, the boy had gathered an incredible amount of necromancy mana. He had pulled it up from around him, and it bubbled and danced in waves. The kitten smirked in amusement, tapping his paw once to send red charges through the gathering mana. Many corpses raced at the young boy, charging with the intent to kill, and Leon was prepared to face them. With a flash, the corpses of the young Lord of Marbas rushed forward to compete with the undead wielded by the little kitten demon. They fought and clashed, weapons smacking against each other with each bash that they fought. The undead wielded by Marbas were quite intense and very strong. While they may be the weakest of the undead minions one could summon, it had barely been a week since the boy learned to channel his magic force. Yet, the young lad already knew how to read the flow of mana even with his eyes closed. It was rather impressive, and the demon thought that, truly, the depth of the young boy's gift boggled the mind. The contractor this time around was a true prodigy, and even Crow was rather impressed. The youth was like the rising star that the first patriarch had once spoken of. Indeed, the kitten grinned, saying that Leon had the potential to plunge the continent into a bloodbath once more. In time, the young boy might even find all that he desires well within his grasp. The crow was excited by this idea, as what he desired was tasty snacks like peanuts, as much as he wanted. The kitten solved the doppelganger and told him to aim higher. The youth may yet unlock the most forbidden of all dark magic, the terrible domain of time regression. The young Leon opened his eyes, and he pushed himself to his feet after his undead had proven victorious against the enemies in the training. Then the youth turned to Marbas, saying that it was done. Then, the boy wanted to do even more training. He would do as much training as he needed to, in order to avenge his father. The corpse was left defeated on the floor, and it was done. The young Leon had defeated the enemies, and he had passed the test, so he asked his little mentor what test he would like him to undertake next. For now, it was best that they moved on. The demons stood together, saying that the next skill that they would master would be dark magic. Leon had heard of it before, and he already had some training in it within their household. The kitten smirked, saying that whatever cheap parlor trick his uncle showed him did not even classify as dark magic. From now on, the boy would have to forget every part of the utter travesty that was called dark magic. The boy then figured that it stood to reason. Considering the swiftness with which progenitor Wellen conquered the entire eastern continent, it would be far-fetched to think that he relied on the undead alone. Their progenitor had loomed over the world with a sort of dark intensity, and the doppelganger crow encouraged this line of thinking. With a snap of his finger, he had switched to our dude's form, and he explained that at its essence, necromancy was just one school of dark magic. In other words, a reserve of mana and proficiency in the dark arts was a necessity in commanding the undead. The boy waved his hand, and a bright purple light hovered over his palm. The Lord Pullen smiled and cooed, saying that it was spoken like a true vassal of their lord progenitor. The kitten just huffed, saying that he was no vassal of the lord and that what they shared was a friendship, a bond much deeper than vassal and lord. Make no mistake, they stood side by side as equals at all times, unlike the shape-shifting Fu. Crow then scoffed, saying that unlike the cat, he had no regrets as to his loyal service. The demon then growled, asking how dare the crow speak so bravely when hiding behind the young Leon's likeness. However, the doppelganger mocked and said that he was unafraid of a kitten. Well, the bickering aside, the young lord wanted to know what sort of magic he would be learning now. Before the boy learned anything, there was something of a prerequisite that must be fulfilled. The cat told them all to be warned, as it would require them to venture into their own subconscious. The boy was surprised to hear this, and the kitten smiled, saying in case they were not aware, the hidden depths of the mind is a vessel of sorts wherein lay a vast reserve of magic force. Once the boy had gained the ability to channel this immense energy, a war of noble houses would be a mere child's play compared to what the boy would truly be capable of. However, the cat would note that dark magic exacted a hefty toll in mana, and the young lord had suspected as much. That being said, the demon highly doubted that the young boy had any cause for concern. If the youth could believe it, the demon actually sensed a great mana reserve in the boy quite equal to or even greater than that of the progenitor of House Marbas, though it remained to be seen whether it would be a blessing or a curse. At any rate, the boy had no choice but to embrace it to revive his household. Leon smiled in relief, and the demon chuckled, adding that the process would not be devoid of risks. There was a way of drawing the boy's hidden potential within their limited time. However, the cat could not even guarantee the boy's safety during the process. Leon was unfazed and simply asked what this miraculous method could be. The demon smiled at the glimmer of life that had come to the boy's dead eyes. It was clear in hindsight that there was only one urge that animated the young Leon. First of all, the boy would have to start by exhausting his currently existing mana to its utter limit. The boy's sense of curiosity seemed to spark a fun reaction in the youth. After the mana had been drained, the boy's potential and subconscious would surely guide the way. So, the boy was ready to let the test commence. The young, seemingly sweet, boy had a primal lust for power, the greatest motivator of all, as it could be seen in Leon's eyes as he banished all original forms of mana from his body. The purple flowed in wave after wave, and the boy sighed in relief when it was gone, figuring that would suffice. The boy nearly fell over from the effort, and Lord Pullen rushed to catch him. The vassal cried that the young lord could not deprive them of his leadership at this very delicate time. However, the demon hissed at the vassal, telling him not to disturb the boy. He had to have faith in the so-called patriarch. The man cried, saying that Lord Leon may be their patriarch, but he was also just a boy. The crow sighed and told the old vassal to pay attention to their words. Their current contractor could well be the most gifted that they had ever seen. It was really the truth. Supposing Leon's potential rivaled Welland's, then he would most certainly return to them. There was no need to worry, and the old vassal could spare his tears for another time. The old vassal cried, saying that he would try his best. Just then, Walter burst into the room, beaming as he announced that he had achieved his success. Now he was a new master of basic swordplay. But he cut off his songs of joy when he spotted the young master flat on the floor. The wolf also immediately started crying that his master could not leave them at this point. But the old vassal told the young Walter to be calm, as he had already made a fool of himself on both their behalf. At any rate, the young wolf had faith that his lordship would make it through. The kitten smirked as these mortals were often alike. The kitten then wondered how such immense talent could have gone undiscovered all these years. It was no surprise that the lineage teetered on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, the young boy seemed deeply asleep, but actually he had been transported to the depths to begin his training. Inside the darkness, the boy looked around, his eyes as dead as ever. The boy stepped forward, exploring the ruins that he had found himself in, and he spotted another waiting inside. The person greeted Leon, saying that he had a feeling that the boy would come. The boy then paused in shock, eyes widening, and the man turned to smile at him. The older-looking man inside his vision told the young boy that it was time for them to walk for a while, as they had much to discuss. Meanwhile, the young boy was still rather stunned to see his father. The place they had transported to was desolate and broken down, with ruins surrounding the area. The boy stared after his father, who had already begun to walk away, but the young boy was transfixed in his spot. The older man halted, realizing that his son was not following, and he called to the boy, saying that his very presence here likely meant that the youth had chosen to channel his dormant magic force. The boy accepted that, but he could not exactly tell how well he was faring. However, he did have a coterie of vassals who rallied to join his cause. The man smiled, calling his sweet son rather fortunate. As the boy might have suspected, his father was just a figment of his mind, and he had already met his demise at Alan's hands. This form was merely a magical record of sorts. The boy noted this information. The reason why his father had ended up this way was none other than his inherent lack of potential. It was a fate that was cruel indeed, and he said that the boy would have to agree. However, Leon fell silent as his father explained that, no matter how he had ended up there, he would still lend his aid to the young boy. As Leon already knew, his father had failed to earn Master Marba's respect, and he was unable to command the Necronomicon, the sacred relic of their lineage. The boy had stared sadly at the book when he was younger. However, by some luck, his son must walk a different path. In life, the man had developed a magic spell that would pass on every bit of their predecessor's mana into the boy's magical reserve. Naturally, the boy would only have partial command of this vast reserve at first. However, it would undoubtedly aid their bid to consolidate power as the house patriarch. The boy blinked, admitting that the father had once said so himself, and he still remembered it. His father had warned of the dangers of taking on someone else's mana as his own. His father had spoken of the risk that the foreign magic force could spiral out of control and shatter his mind altogether. The father noted that his son listened well and that magic energy printed with a specific case's pattern did not lend itself easily to be absorbed by another. However, the young boy was the exception. It may not make much sense to him now, but the young boys should consider themselves a blank slate. The boy considered that idea for a moment, echoing his father's words. Since Lord Welland von Marbas, the progenitor of their bloodline, no one else had possessed such a perfectly pure reserve of dark mana. The father then demonstrated as he gathered up some mana in his hands to show the young boy. The youth was blessed with the greatest gift of their lineage, and the young boy watched the mana gather with awe in his eyes. There was a rumbling of bright purple magic, burning within him like a gorgeous gem. The rumbling caused the already broken down surroundings to dance and swirl around them, charging up with power and strength. This intense and overflowing power was who Leon von Marbas was. The figure of his father reminded the boy that he must always remember this power. The rumbling got even louder as the surrounding area was charged with magic and amazing purple light. The man smiled at his child and then reached out to ruffle the young boy's head. It seemed that their little reunion had finally come to an end for now. The young child looked up with hope in his eyes, asking his father if they would meet again. The man smiled, saying, of course. The figure, after all, still had so much to teach him, and more to teach the young boy as his father. The man waved his hand in the air, and the bright purple awe thrummed with power. The beautiful item passed on from the former lord to the new lord of the house. The young boy regarded the power with wonder. The boy had never felt such immense magic force in his life, and the power swished in and out of him, finally settling in his heart. This amulet was named Greed, and as the name suggested, it would devour everything that the boy set underneath his feet with feral glee. The man reminded the young boy to never forget, holding the amulet gently in his hands. Greed. The young lord swore that he would bear this in mind. The ground beneath their feet began to crack, and it was time for the father to move on. The next time they met, the boy would return when his heart desired, and Leon bowed, saying that may that day soon bring them together again. Then, the young boy was gone, and his father was left in the spiritual realm. The man then said softly to himself that if wishing made it so, then he hoped that his child would shine radiantly as the continent's most wondrous rising star. However, the future was not his to see, and there was no telling whether this power would lead to the boy's glory or to his downfall. In the man's darkest despair, he feared, deep down inside, that it would be the latter. Meanwhile, all three vassals and the demon Lord Marbas hovered over the young boy as they patiently waited for him to wake. Leon was deeply asleep, believed to still be training hard to regain the power of his ancestors. Sir Pullen then asked if they were quite sure that the boy would awaken. The vassal did not dare to question the demon's wisdom. But the little boy was barely 14 years old, and the vassal worried that an ailment would occur and leave a permanent effect. They hardly saw how they could possibly face previous patriarchs in the afterlife if the poor boy died. The Amon huffed that the vassal would sooner join the ancestors before his little prodigy. Besides, if the young lord was incapable of withstanding such a basic trial, then he was indeed better off dead. Then, Marbas told the vassal to set aside his worries and to wait patiently for the patriarch in good faith. The wolf agreed, saying that he was sure that the young lord would pull through. There was no need to worry. Even the crow tried cheering up poor Sir Pullen. The doppelganger thought that the elderly minion fretted too much. Suddenly, there was a burst of purple aura and vast energy surrounding the little boy. The demon beamed, saying that he could now see that there was a reason behind the boy's delayed awakening. Walter was both surprised and concerned, asking what was behind the odd magic force. The wolf had never seen something so dense and vast. The little kitten hopped up, dancing around on the sleeping boy. Soon, Leon would return, so they had to make ready to greet him when he did. The others were told to be on their guard as the patriarch who would arise would now be a different being altogether from the boy whom they once knew. The young boy suddenly snapped his eyes open with a jolt, and the old vassal was beyond relieved to see the boy. The youth stared with a blank look on his face, and he muttered, understanding why his chest had felt so heavy. Then, he asked his mentor to kindly get rid of him. However, his mentor was not interested in doing that. Later, Walter was back to practicing his sword fighting in the training grounds. The young Marbas lord was there as well, firing up his necromancy magic. They had even prepared the few soldiers they had left, positioning them and running them through drills in the preparation for battle. House Sylvester would show up in 4 days, when the War of Noble Houses was to begin. The Marva's household had to be prepared as the heavily guarded and armed army of men marched through their borders and to their fortress. The Lord of the House of Sylvester sat on his grand chair and then finally pushed to his feet. The time had come, and all the soldiers of House Sylvester heeded him. On this long day, the centuries-long history of the once proud House Marvas would fade away into the dusty footnotes of history. The man roared, telling his soldiers to follow him to write history anew. The men had cheered, giving glory to the House of Sylvester. However, the doppelganger Sir Kirchel just stood among the crowd, listening to the Lord of Sylvester's plans. A black bird sat in the dense forest, fog surrounding the area as a group of men rode through the leafless forest. The Lord of House Sylvester smirked as he passed through the area, noting the weakness in their deployment with the fewest soldiers. It was indeed an excellent insight once again, and the Lord was quite grateful to Sir Kirchel for selling out his people. The fake uncle was also pretty grateful himself, saying that this was the least that he could do to repay the man's magnanimous treatment. Still, the wicked lord found himself rather surprised. He had thought those sentimental Marvas fools would have guarded the tombs of their ancestors more zealously. It was even extra foolish of them to deploy the bulk of their forces on a wide open field such as this one. The fake uncle laughed, saying that they were a house of necromancers, not strategists. The man supposed that there was a tendency to err on the side of caution so as not to destroy the ancestral burial sites. The Marvas family name may have plummeted into the dirt long ago, yet still they struggle in futility to uphold their former reputation. Kirchel supposed so, and this made the Sylvester head rather suspicious, asking why his sidekick had paused. He asked if the old man had something to report. The old man said that he had nothing to say to Lord Sylvester, and instead he suggested that they continue on their way through the dark and rather desolate-looking graveyard. Suddenly, the Lord of Sylvester slowed as he noticed something odd. There seemed to be a ground approaching as they rode through the mist, and they identified the young Lord of Marvas riding beside the Wolf of Marvas. The youths looked rather intimidating in the dark, and the army paused before the Lord of House Sylvester, both houses having met in the middle. The young Marvas lord smiled, saying that just as they had agreed, the Lord of House Sylvester was a rather punctual man after all. The wicked man laughed, saying that he had come expecting the weak spot of a fallen house, but here the boy was with 100 soldiers all armed to the teeth. The man immediately pulled out his sword, slashing without hesitation at Kirchel as he suspected that there was some deception at play. The man's head truly did fall off, but instead of blood, dark purple magic bubbled from his severed neck. The man's head flew, separate from his body, and the crow huffed in annoyance, saying that only his master had the right to strike him with a sword. The head floated up, already changing shape, much to the horror of the Lord of Sylvester. Dark purple smoke still spilled from the body's neck. Suddenly, the head reattached and the old Kirchel stared at the shocked enemy house lord, smiling as he said that it was indeed a novel experience. Now the enemy lord was concerned. He had slit the old man's throat clean and the old man should be dead. This was just the beginning of the new nightmare because the fog began to clear as the old man casually rode up to join the young lord. The Lord of Sylvester screamed in rage, saying that the old man and the house would be punished for their insolence along with their patriarch. They had no chance of prevailing against him with a meager force of only hundreds, and this was an insult against the head of House Sylvester. The young Marvas said that the idea was ridiculous. After all, the Lord of Sylvester would have to be a threat to be worthy of an insult at all. The boy's eyes were dark with glee as he regarded the wretch that had caused his father's death. Sylvester was enraged. There was a reason that the young Lord of Marvas had agreed to this war, and he sprinkled out an odd purple dust in the air as he stood before the man. See, the little Leon so desired to put the arrogant Lord of Sylvester in his place. The powder turned to goo and made a loud splat when it hit the ground, and a bubbling started beneath the ground. Suddenly, from the dirt burst an army of the undead, their eyes glowing red as they charged at the Lord of House Sylvester and his men. The man of the house, Sylvester, was horrified to see that his enemy could use necromancy. The young boy noted that Count Sylvester was as sharp as ever. The man already sounded astounded that a house of necromancers could call upon the powers of the undead. Honestly, Leon was quite tired of correcting their surprise. Necromancy was his birthright, and it should not be so surprising to see him exercise it. Meanwhile, the Lord of the House, Sylvester, was stunned as he stared at the approaching demons. He recalled how he had asked the guard about the greatest injustice that a human being could experience: to be faced with an overwhelming foe against which there was no hope, no means of resistance, and to only watch helplessly as one's entire world came crashing down. That was what the man felt now, the greatest suffering in the world. All of this suffering had come as a result of inborn talent, talent that he had overlooked, talent that he had naively assumed would not be that much of a problem. The old man had been deadly wrong, and the talent of such immense depth had appeared that all he could do was stand in awe. There was no other variable upon the battlefield that was quite as consequential as the dead eyes that Leon now used to regard him as his soldiers were slaughtered one by one. The men fought bravely, but they would be no match for the undead, and quickly the walking corpses speared through the handsome men. Then all was said and done. The enemy was still a young boy, and one soldier thought that there was no amount of raw talent that could possibly prepare him for the brutality of a tooth and nail melee. The man lunged through the undead, racing to take Leon's head. However, the soldier was stopped by the appearance of yet another fighter, a sword wielder with shocking snow-white hair. Yes, it was Walter, and the Beast Boy had not come around to play, knocking the sword of his opponent aside. The man yelled, asking who dared to stand in his way, and the Beast Man stood with his sword drawn and his eyes red. He was afraid that he could not let the mad soldier anywhere near their young mother. That was the young wolf's duty, and he meant to stay true to it. The wolf then smiled that he had found a very nice purpose. Meanwhile, the battle raged on as men and monsters clashed in an epic fight. The man of Sylvester yelled for the mage company to commence the onslaught, and the mages moved forward, hoping to defeat the necromancy with their own magical power. Their blue light of magic crackled with intensity and burned bright with his purity. There was a huge explosion as they fired off their magic amongst the undead. Then the Lord Sylvester called to the Knights of the Vanguard, telling them to storm their ranks at once. As long as the Lord of House Sylvester stood steady and without wavering, he could still lead his team to victory. They charged forward and clashed as they fought with their swords, stabbing and crashing at each other. The young boy watched the battle move, keeping his eyes on all the important pieces at play. The Lord Sylvester fought, keeping morale bubbling in his team as he swung his sword. The man with the blue eyes said that he was a fearful man in his inborn nature, and it did not matter if his foe was his eldest brother, who should have been the rightful patriarch, or his elder sister. The man had never once considered his siblings as his kin in any earnest sense of the word. Now, Leon asked why he should care at all about the Sylvester family drama, as it did sound rather boring to listen to at the moment. The boy's hand trembled with necromancy power, and the evil man started with burning eyes of anger of his own. The Sylvester Lord said that a spoiled lordling who was handed everything on a silver platter from the day he was born could never hope to muster the sheer grit that it would take to defeat him. The man asked the young patriarch to answer his question. Did the young boy crave vengeance? If this were so, then the Sylvester Lord promised that the boy would die empty-handed with only his regret left in his stomach. With these words, the evil Sylvester Lord charged at Leon with his sword drawn. However, the young Leon said that there were two flaws in the Lord of Sylvester's assumptions, and the boy would happily explain. The eye of the necromancy book shone as the boy faced the man who had ordered his father's death, and those once empty eyes shone with the green light of a predator seeking out his prey. Leon had no lust for revenge, nor did he consider the Lord of House Sylvester powerful enough to make a dent in his life. That was all there was to it. And with that, we'll end the episode here. I hope you guys enjoyed the continuation of this series, as there will be more to come very soon. Make sure you like the video if you want to see more of it sooner, and leave your comments down below to let me know what you think about this story so far. As always, I'll now get to working on more scripts, so see you guys in future uploads. Until next time.